My name is Henry, and I live in a run-down town in the English Midlands. This particular town is semi-rural though, and is surrounded by farmland, paddocks, and on one side the estate of a duke. There are also at least 3 small areas of woodland dotted around within the town, one of which is very close to my school, filling the gap between the local athletic track and the train line. It is best accessed by crossing an old bridge that is now covered in grass, but once had itself carried a train track. I suppose this must mean that most of the trees there were planted within my parents' lifetime, after the railroad connections were overhauled. I'm now in my late teens, but this story takes place several years ago, when I was 13. I was a hormone-driven adolescent, and in some ways still naive. Also, I was, and still am, sexually submissive. I largely attributed this to my first kiss being physically forced on me by a girl called Natalie, but I digress. At the aforementioned school near the wood, I became good friends with a guy called Ben. His sister Alice was also in our year at school. They were twins, you see. Despite that, Ben seemed to distance himself from Alice as much as possible. I assumed this to merely be sibling rivalry, or perhaps an excessive fear of potential embarrassment. Alice had a pretty face, and an attractively plump bottom. Boys mostly ignored her though, partly because she was quiet, and partly because, to be honest, she often looked a bit of a mess. Seemingly unbrushed hair, heavily creased blouse, smudged mascara. Not all the time, but such things weren't rare. I fancied her anyway though. In fact, her intermittently disheveled appearance seemed to me to somehow add to her charm. Her brother Ben noticed the frequency to which I looked at her, and the way that I did so, and told me to stay away from her. I presumed it was just him being protective of his sister, and I ignored him, and asked her out anyway, keeping it a secret from Ben. She wanted to go for a walk in the woods. Frankly, it would have been a very short walk. A very slow walker could have probably got from one side to the other in under 15 minutes. I guessed, therefore, that Alice had more in mind for us to do in the woods than just walk, and this seemed like an exciting prospect. So on the Saturday late in the afternoon, I met her by the wood. We headed in, holding hands. She guided us away from the main trail, and diagonally down the bank, dodging foxholes and branches. Suddenly, she turned to me and said, "Do you like bondage, Henry?" I blushed. We were still quite young, and I didn't expect Alice to also have come across it. Yes, actually," I said. Letting go of my hand, she crouched down by a large tree with a hollow in the trunk, reached into the dark, damp hole, and retrieved from it a small metal box. She set it on the ground and flicked open the clasps. When she opened it, my eyes went wide at the contents. A wide variety of items, almost none of which I expected Alice to possess. Cigarettes, a pocket knife, oracle cards, an adult toy, and some other items. Most relevantly to her inquiry, there was a pair of handcuffs, real ones, not the sort where you flick a little switch and they open. No, these ones required the key. She cuffed me to a tree, and I cooperated. It was exciting. I guessed that kissing would follow, or maybe more if I were lucky. After all, the contents of her secret stash suggested that she was more of a bad girl than I had thought. My anticipation became visible through my trousers. Alice smirked at the proof of my arousal. It crossed my mind that if she knew about bondage, she might also know about things like pain play. But that didn't sound too bad either. Of course, I was imagining the safe, sane, and consensual kind of slap on the cheek and a pinch kind of thing. Nothing that were likely to cause real harm. Unfortunately, it turned out that Alice was much further than that cute, shy girl than she actually seemed. She turned back to the little box. The next item to be taken out was the pocket knife. She unfolded it, made eye contact, and licked along the blade suggestively, and stepped towards me. I was scared now. Was she messing with me? No way she'd use that on me, right? Alice? What are you doing? I said with a shaky voice. She breathed her answer into my ear. Let's call it penetration. She grinned at her sinister pun, flicked the blade twice like a nurse flicks a syringe, and plunged it into me. I screamed. She pulled it in and out and thrust it in me again. I screamed again and began to cry. She laughed at my tears and continued her torture. In total, she stabbed me 5 times on the right side of my stomach, just above my left hip, my right arm, my left shoulder, and my right thigh, narrowly missing my femoral artery. If she'd severed that, it's doubtful I would have survived. By either blind luck or divine providence, a young, strong man called Edward was passing the old grassy bridge, heading home from an afternoon of running practice at the athletic track. At about the moment of my first or maybe second scream, hearing it, he bravely rushed into the woods and, following the sound of my subsequent screams and pleas for mercy, managed to find the bloody scene with remarkable speed. Seeing Edward appear, the expression of sadistic glee on her blood-spattered face turned into one of terrible anger, likely rooted in the frustration of the interruption of her twisted and grotesque act. She slashed her knife at him. Unfortunately for her, Edward was a keen martial artist. Impressively, he disarmed her without her landing a single stab or cut on him. I cannot accurately describe his techniques. I was preoccupied with enduring my excruciating pain. In the end, Alice had a broken arm and was pinned face down on the ground while Edward called for the ambulance service and police force. I was in hospital for a long time. I needed blood transfusions, and I had lost a dangerous amount of blood. I needed my wounds to be stitched together, antibiotics for infections, and also surgery on my intestines, as the stab to my stomach had lacerated them. With results both life-threatening and also disgusting to a puke-worthy degree. I'm sure listeners will sympathize that I pressed charges, given the seriousness of the assault, though they may also think I'm an idiot for getting myself into that situation. There was of course a trial, and unsurprisingly, Alice was found guilty of grievous bodily harm. She is now in prison. I believe there was a psychiatric assessment for her, but no diagnosis was made that could have made her innocent by reason of insanity. As I understand it, she was just essentially sexually sadistic, but at the most extreme and violent end of the scale, and lacking the strength of conscience necessary to restrain herself from acting out her darkest fantasies. I'm still friends with Ben, but I don't go into his house because his mother is pissed that I put her daughter in a cage. She seems to vow Alice's sentence as disproportionate retribution for a silly mistake. Ben appears embarrassed that his mother is not more understanding than that. It turns out that Ben knew, or at least strongly suspected, that his sister was dangerous, and he had tried to warn me away. That time, when I thought he was just being protective. Alice had bullied Ben growing up, was apparently rebellious and somewhat hostile when not in public, and watched very extreme sadomasochist adult content. After catching her watching a shock video, Ben had snooped on her browser history, and it was jaw-dropping. Her browser history was actually involved in the trial as evidence, just to prove her fascination with sexualized violence. I learnt the hard way not to let people you barely know tie you up. Sadly, women and even girls can be violent too, not just males. Personally, the last half of 2017 has been pretty exhausting. The most draining part, both emotionally, physically, and financially, has been the laborious task of moving my father into an aged care facility due to his rapidly advancing dementia. He lives in Tasmania, where I grew up, and I'm currently working and living in Brisbane, which is about 1,500 miles away, north of Tasmania. I have been making 3.5-hour flights down to Tasmania about twice a month to sort out my dad's situation. I have been busying myself by fixing up his empty, dilapidated home in order to get it ready to be sold. I moved out all of his furniture and belongings, save for a pile of blankets and pillows that I turned into a makeshift bed on the floor while I'm visiting. The house is situated in a semi-rural area, surrounded by overgrown trees and bushes. It's an old house, damp, everything creaks, and there's currently no electricity, which is very creepy during the night. The house itself is not very secure. With no security system, the doors have locks, but a forceful nudge will pop them open. I flew in on Christmas Eve in the late evening, picked up my hire car to make the hour-long drive down to the house. I stopped in at a mate's place who lives about 10 minutes away from my dad to have a few beers and chat about the year that had just passed. After a few hours, I realized I had probably surpassed the legal blood alcohol limit to drive. My mate's legendary wife dropped me off at my dad's and offered to come back in the morning to pick me up and go back to their place to get my car. A Christmas miracle. I entered my dad's house around midnight. The house inside was pitch black, and in my slightly drunken state, I flipped the light switch and nothing happened. Oh yeah. No power. Right. Using my phone as a light to navigate my way through the house, over the creaky floorboards, I noticed that some of the tools that I had left laying around the house had been stolen. I sighed and accepted the fact that it was my own stupid fault for leaving them out in an unsecure house. Some kids probably noticed that no one is living there and took advantage of the situation. It was unsettling knowing that someone had been there, but I didn't bother calling the police over a hammer, wrench, and screwdriver that came to a grand total of about $16. Good news was the big toolbox, which I kept locked up in the laundry cupboard that houses the more expensive power tools, was still there and intact. I studied the padlock and the space around it, and it looked pretty scratched up and dented, like someone had crudely attempted to prise it open. Nice try, morons, I said aloud to myself. The toolbox is very big and heavy, and too big for one person to carry unless you're Andre the Giant. Exhausted, I went into one of the furnitureless rooms and made my makeshift bed out of blankets and pillows. I couldn't get comfortable, and it was taking me a while to drift off to sleep. As I was laying there, the only sound I could hear over the ringing of my tinnitus was the gentle rustling of leaves and the wind through the trees. I could also hear what sounded like the unmistakable crunch of boots on gravel that went up the side of the house. I tried to listen harder, when there was a loud gong sound of something solid coming in contact with the metal railing that leads up to the back door. This made me sit up wide-eyed while my heart races. Maybe it was a wallaby or possum. I sit there. It's possible. I was just listening. I could hear the sounds of trees in the wind and nothing else for a few moments, and then I start to calm down. This was interrupted by the pop and squeak of the back door being pushed open. Crap. Now I freeze. Not knowing what to do, I could hear footsteps creaking through the back of the house, and I hear the laundry cupboard being opened. I was at the other end of the hallway, but I could hear whispers. The only words that I could make out were, "There, shh, quick." I pull myself together, pull out my phone and call the police. I chat to the dispatcher while burying my head under the pillow and muffling my voice. I explain the situation to the dispatcher, and says that the police are on their way. While this is happening, I can hear a chink sound of what I'm assuming was the lock of the toolbox trying to be broken. The dispatcher suggests that I lock the door of the room I'm in. I agree, and I slowly pad over across the room to the door. One of the floorboards creaks so loudly. I freeze and hear dead silence from the laundry room. They must have heard. After about 30 seconds of standing still, I try to take another step and get yet another high-pitched creak. But this seems to work in my favor, because my new house guests scatter away out the back door. I lock the bedroom door, tell the dispatcher that I think they've gone, and she tells me to stay put until the police arrive, and I tell her that I'm more than happy to comply. After about 5 minutes, the cops arrive, and the dispatcher bids me farewell. The police did a search of the area, but as expected, found nothing. They had tried to break open the toolbox. One of the cops says, "Why didn't they just use bolt cutters? Amateurs." And we all have a laugh. I explained to the police about how when I came home, some of the tools that I had left lying around were stolen, and that the toolbox looked like it had already been attempted to be broken into. Upon hearing that, the other cops started his theory of how the events took place. They probably broke in earlier tonight before you got there, grabbed what they could, tried to open the toolbox but couldn't, and then left to go get something else to open it with. While they were gone, you came home, and they arrived back here to open the toolbox. I doubt they were dangerous, probably just kids. Good timing, I think to myself. I made the report and that was that. I stayed up until sunrise, then decided to get a couple of hours sleep until my mate's wife came to pick me up and collect my car. I ask if I can keep my tools at their place for safekeeping, to which they agree. I drove down to my dad's old folks' home and had Christmas lunch with him and his new elderly buddies. The following day, I go to a hardware store and purchase some new, sturdier door locks. To preface this, I work for a very famous pest control company. I'm an inspector, meaning I crawl into rat holes for a living. Sometimes figuratively, and unfortunately for me, sometimes literally. This story happened back in February, and it still bothers me now. I also want to point out that I'm not scared of creepy crawlies of any kind. Spiders, roaches and rats do nothing but annoy me. All that being said, let's get on with the story. It was late in the day when I got this job from the manager. He says it's about a fly problem, and it's kind of out of the way, but also says the only time I could get there is this week. Usually I'm done with my day by 5 p.m, but now I'm not getting home till 7. It's sundown by the time I get there, and I'm trying my best not to phone it in. The house itself surprised me because I was expecting it to be a dump. This place was your average 2-story farmhouse like you'd see in a movie. The place almost looked like they'd put a fresh coat of paint on it. So when I met the customer, she was clearly burnt out. We're talking like give or take 3 hours of sleep, and the flies are a major contributing factor. The woman is in her late 30s, and by my guess keeps a clean house. There were no funky smells or trash lying around or filth that I could see. In my professional opinion, there was no reason why she should have flies. To be clear, these aren't drain flies or gnats or tiny flies like that. They're standard house flies, and there's an ungodly amount of them. In the living room alone, there's got to be over 250 dead flies, and that's only one room. But there's got to be thousands of them in this place. It's way too many flies for the normal stuff we inspect for. At this point, I've gone into full home inspection mode. I'm doing everything short of tearing down walls to figure this out. Obviously, I'm trying to make a sale here, but in my defense, a problem of this size requires professional help. So up until now, my theory was something died in the walls. That was the logical answer I was hoping for. But this is the point where logic has left me completely behind. Now I bet a lot of people are thinking I saw something in her basement. Well, too bad, because the basement was the first place I inspected. I then climbed into her attic, and this wasn't a walk-in attic, it was unfinished and full of insulation. That's when I had to stop and reevaluate the situation. I get my ladder, and it's just tall enough for me to pull myself into the attic. The only light I have is my inspection flashlight, and at this time of day, it could use a charge. What I saw almost made me fall through the ceiling. It looked like someone had been living in this woman's attic and was doing messed up stuff. I'm talking about making things out of dead animals and drawing pentagrams with blood. Now, even I was asking myself how nobody could smell this horror show. That has a logical answer. The attic has a moisture barrier under the insulation which covered the smell. So after I documented everything for my inspection report and for the police, I made sure that the attic was totally sealed. I told my customer, my manager, and a police officer, and I got the hell out of there. Since then, it's almost like twice a week I have crazy night terrors, and I never had them before. I'm Catholic, meaning I don't mess with anything paranormal, but if I were to guess, whatever evil was hiding in the attic was pissed I blew its cover. Now I keep a Bible on my nightstand. For reference, I am a 27-year-old female, and this story takes place 10 years ago, when I was 17. I had just started university, and was excited about having a fresh, new start, since I'd always been a nerdy outcast in high school. I had never had a boyfriend before. I'd never even been on a date, so I was naive and optimistic about boys. My introverted and awkward personality hadn't magically changed since entering university, so it's safe to say that I didn't meet any interesting guys at school. One late night, I was in my room working on an assignment on my laptop when I received a request on MSN Messenger. The email address was a boy's name with some numbers. The name was clearly ethnic and likely someone of the same origin as me. Intrigued, I accepted. For the sake of the story, we'll call the boy Ken. We got chatting, and I asked him how he had gotten my email address. He dodged the question. I let it go, not thinking too much into it. This was from a time when it was normal to accept anyone and everyone as a friend on Facebook, as well as other social media platforms. As Ken and I continued to talk, I learned that he lived in my city, and apparently wasn't much older than me. As I guessed, our roots were in fact in the same country, the motherland. I asked him why he didn't have a picture of himself on his display picture, and this prompted him to suggest that we turn on our webcams because he wanted to see me too. I declined, but he insisted. Somehow he convinced me, and we both switched on our webcams. I was pleasantly surprised and somewhat relieved to see that Ken was a good-looking young guy, chatting to me from the comfort of his bedroom, seemingly very normal. Our MSN chats carried on for a few weeks. They developed into texts, and we even had a few phone calls, after I had agreed to give him my phone number. I started to develop a crush on Ken. He asked me to go out with him a few times, but I was always pretty busy with school, and our schedules weren't lining up. Finally, we found one afternoon when we were both free and decided to schedule a lunch date. Ken had a car and had offered to pick me up from my university after I was done for the day. I was a little too dressed up for my C+ programming class, but just right for the lunch date we had planned at the local vegetarian restaurant. Stupidly, I didn't tell any of my friends where I was going or with whom because I was embarrassed about going on my very first date at almost age 18 with someone who had randomly added me on MSN. I waited outside my building when a black car with heavily tinted windows pulled up beside me. The passenger side window rolled down, and sure enough, there was Ken sitting in the driver's seat. I was happy to see that he was just as cute in person as he was on webcam. However, what I wasn't expecting was the intense smell of weed floating out the car. Not relevant, but it is part of the first impression. Admittedly, I was a bit taken aback and was concerned that he might be driving high. He unlocked the doors and motioned for me to get in, so I did without dispute. As I sat down in the passenger seat, he immediately put his hands on my thigh. I nervously shifted my leg away. "So," I started, "do you know where the restaurant is? I can guide you if you want." He smirked at me, but didn't say anything and just started driving. Okay, kinda weird. I thought maybe I was just nervous or awkward, both of which I could sympathize with, so I let it be. I was about to try my hand at a little small talk, which I'm no good at, when I noticed him heading towards the highway ramp. I started to worry, because the restaurant was not far from my campus and there was no reason for us to be getting the highway. You don't need to get the highway. The restaurant's actually really nearby. I can guide you. I tried to keep my voice steady, but I could hear my own nervousness. Ken finally spoke for the first time since I'd gotten in the car. Thought maybe we could, go to my place instead. We can play Need for Speed and I can make you lunch. I was 17, and on my way to the house of a guy I'd just met for the first time, and I hadn't told anyone where I was going. My mind was racing. I knew that this would be an utterly stupid thing to do, and despite the clear red flags waving in my face, I decided that I didn't want to ruin our first date by rejecting his offer to make me lunch and play NFS together, which I told him I liked playing. Don't judge me. So like an idiot, I reluctantly agreed to avoid being rude. We made it to his house. It was apparently his family's home and was situated in a sort of shady neighborhood. We stepped inside, and of course no one was home except us. It was sparsely furnished and looked unkempt, which struck me as pretty odd for a family home. He informed me that his Xbox was in his bedroom. I hesitated in the doorway, but he sat at the foot of his bed, in front of the TV, and patted the empty space beside him for me to have a seat. There was literally nowhere else to sit in this room, so I cautiously sat down, keeping as much distance as I could between us. I started to relax as we played NFS, and he made us PB&Js to munch on. I was about to laugh at myself for being overly paranoid when Ken did something bizarre. He got up onto the bed and sat down directly behind me, his legs on either side of me, an extremely awkward position, and tried to guide my hands on the controller. I started to ask him what he was doing, and as if this wasn't uncomfortable enough, his hands moved from the controller and slid under my shirt. That is when I really started to panic. I thought he was going to try and grope my chest, but instead, he started squeezing and massaging my belly. I was more than a little chubby back then, freshman 15 and then some, so you can imagine what that might have been like. I dropped the controller in pure shock and quickly stood up, fixing my shirt. I was at a loss for words, and he did nothing but smirk at me and tell me he liked it. I felt completely disgusted and violated. I'd had enough. I lied and told him that I had a group project to work on and needed to go. He asked where I lived so that he could drop me home. Thankfully, I had the common sense to not tell him and asked him to drop me back at school instead, where I would be supposedly meeting my classmates, and he obliged. After our very uncomfortable first date, I decided I didn't want to talk to Ken anymore. I didn't block him on MSN or my phone, our only two methods of communication, but I rarely responded to his messages, and I ignored all of his calls. Once he messaged me on MSN at around 11 PM, asking me to come over, and telling me that he would send a cab to bring me over to his place. Thoroughly annoyed, I responded, "What do you take me for? Why do you even think I would want to go to that?" He replied saying that it was nothing dirty, and that he promised. It was just bizarre. I was disgusted and didn't even reply. He continued trying to get in touch with me for months, and then suddenly vanished. I figured he'd finally gotten the point. Now, I wish the story ended here, but it doesn't. I last heard from Ken in late February. He had stopped trying to contact me shortly after Valentine's Day. In April, 2 nuclear family members and I went on a holiday to visit another relative called Annie, who was living in the Caribbean at the time. Annie, who I love dearly, was and still is a bit of an eccentric. She considers herself very spiritual, and is an active member of a large, well-known spiritual organization. She is deeply connected with the motherland, more than the rest of us are, and goes back for frequent visits. While we stayed with her in the Caribbean, she told us about her most recent trip to the motherland, where she met a wealthy and well-connected local woman through the organization, who quickly became a very close friend, Connie, the con artist. During our visit, Anne introduced us to Connie virtually over Skype, because Connie lives in the motherland. We chatted to her a few times through our vacation via Skype, and got to know her a little bit. Little did we know back then that Connie, who Annie had spontaneously met halfway across the world in the motherland, would soon wreak utter havoc on our lives. Now, that's a story that I'm just not ready to tell, and perhaps may never be, because of how many lives were affected and the severity of the damage that had been inflicted. What you need to know is that Connie was an outright criminal and con artist who had been targeting our family from long before Annie, who had actually met her. Their meeting was no coincidence. Not only did she manage to steal over $100,000 from our family, but she took any peace of mind or sense of security we had with it. When we finally caught on and confronted her, she insisted that we were mistaken, but disappeared into thin air once we forced her out of our lives. You're probably wondering what on earth this has to do with the story about Ken. Well, get this. The situation with Connie lasted many months. The whole thing is kind of a blur to me now, but as we spoke to her online in April, I remember the whole ordeal lasting well into the fall. While she normally resided in the motherland, Annie had invited her to visit and stay with us, where we, my whole family and I, presently live. That's when things really took a turn for the worse. Some of the things I clearly remember, and are important to this story, were that 1, the whole time she was staying with us, she was trying to convince me to transfer schools to a very obscure school and program in the US. I don't even live in the US, and was actually getting very pushy about it. And 2, she had asked me if I was a virgin, and told me to save myself and my husband. Disturbing, I know. During this time, I was so emotionally drained and stressed that I didn't really think of anything but the situation at hand. In fact, I had stopped socializing almost entirely, and even started habitually skipping classes. I had lost contact with my high school friends, and my university friends were too new to really care, so my strange behavior and new destructive habits went unnoticed. Fast forward one day, after Connie's final disappearance in the fall, I was home with my dad when my cell phone rang. I looked at the caller ID, and it was a number I didn't have saved, so it was showing the contact information as whatever name the phone was registered under. My heart dropped to my stomach. My phone displayed a name. The first name was a man's name, and the last name was the same last name as Connie's. I began to panic, and I ran into my bedroom to answer the call. I had no idea what to expect, and when I answered the phone, I was greeted with a familiar voice. It was Ken. I honestly thought I was going to puke when I suddenly came to a realization that he had been a part of this whole sick plot. Of course, I don't have hard evidence to prove that he was connected to Connie, but let me explain. The timing of his appearance and reappearance into my life, the last name, a fairly unique surname originating from the part of the motherland where Connie is from, and I had never known Ken's last name until then, and the fact that he contacted me out of the blue, I had no idea why or how. It was all just too bizarre to be a mere coincidence. Of course, I freaked out at Ken when he called me, and I told him that if he ever called me again, I would call the police. His response was just a weird, dry half laugh, and then he said, "Well, okay then," in the most creepy voice you can think of, and hung up. I knew in my gut that was their last attempt to get back in touch and somehow slither their way back into mine and my family's lives. Thankfully, I never heard from Ken again after that day. A while after all of this ended, I was having a conversation with a family member who was also closely involved in all of this, about the whole ordeal, and she told me she'd sensed something extremely wrong with Connie. She was pushing to have me sent off to the US to that obscure school, and she had an unshakable feeling that Connie was involved in some sort of human trafficking scene, and that, if I left, she would never see me again. The horrifying pieces came together. and I was just too damn naive to have seen it before. The memories flooded back to me when I heard that. How Ken told me, nothing dirty I promise, when he invited me over, and how Connie was telling me to remain a virgin. As I said, I had never told a soul about Ken, nor about the weird V-card conversation with Connie. I strongly and firmly believe that Ken had been a sort of player in Connie's game, and was just there to keep me away from guys and prevent me from having a boyfriend. For those of you wondering why we never called the police on Connie nor Ken, because nothing illegal ever happened at face value. It's a bit hard to explain. I'll also mention that I tried to find Ken online many times after everything ended. I don't know why. Perhaps I felt like I wanted to expose him or call him out, and wasn't able to find a sliver of information on him. Not by the name Ken, nor by the name on the caller ID. It was as if he never existed. Also, from this incident onwards, I can't stomach a lot of these spiritual organizations. I never liked the idea to begin with, but now I've truly experienced how they can both attract the vulnerable and unsavory, who are looking for someone vulnerable to prey on. No judgments to those who are into those sort of things. It just isn't for me personally. I would like to hear what you guys think of this. Do you think my suspicions are plausible? What do you make of Ken and Annie? And to you both, I hope you rot in hell. Rewind to my freshman year of college, sometime in mid-autumn. I was 18, living in the dorms and almost fully recovered from being sick with shingles. I was walking towards the elevator to go running. Our hall was the only one of the dorms that had an elevator. It was supposed to be for physically disabled people, but we didn't have anyone in our hall who was disabled, so it was almost never used. I was the only one who really ever used it. I figure I'm running 5 miles today. I can afford to be a little lazy. He appeared as I was walking towards the elevator. Pale skin, dark hair, just standing there dressed like a college student, and looked to be about that age. He wore plaid shorts and a t-shirt. He was transparent and barely discernible against the backdrop of the deserted elevator. I could barely see him, but he was there. There was no one else around. He looked at me, none too kindly, and I noticed that he had pale yellow eyes, no pupils, just yellow eyes that shone like lights, and the air around me had become very, very cold. It freaked the hell out of me. I booked it towards the elevator, and as I got near it, he vanished, and so did the cold. I went down, did my work, and came back. I don't believe I ever used the elevator again, and I've never seen anything like him since. For what it's worth, I went to a private religious university, and I'm currently back here for my master's program. Though this experience was in 2011, and obviously I had no reason to visit the dorms again. I don't really know what that was, and I don't particularly care to know. Could have just been a weird side effect of shingles. I know it can do odd things to your neurology, or who knows, it could have been something more sinister. Just interesting that even now, I still think about it, and it makes me shake. I'm turning 19 this year, and this story happened when I was 15. I had just got into my junior year and created my first Twitter account, that I deleted because of this story. For reference, I didn't tell anyone my username on Twitter, my family nor friends, because I didn't have any. My profile picture was an avatar, so no pictures of me on the account. And as for my location, I live in Paris, but in the suburbs and didn't have many followers, 20, maybe 30, and didn't follow that many people. So my tagline was not very interesting. One evening in October, someone sent me quite a strange DM. It was an account with 200 followers, and the message went something like this. Hi, I'm Rob. I just turned 17 and wanted to know if you lived in Meudon, because I will move soon and go to the town high school and I'm looking for friends. Meudon obviously being the place I lived. I immediately thought something was wrong because there was nowhere on my profile that actually specified where I lived. But after thinking, I remembered a tweet I made a few weeks ago about buses and mentioned the city. So I told myself he just looked up Moudon and found my tweet. His age wasn't shocking because I'm 2 years ahead of my classmates. I was bored and he was polite, so I replied, and told him I did indeed live here and go to high school. The discussion was normal. We talked about a lot that night, mainly about high school, about the food in the cafeteria, the teachers, the kind of things that we did, but it was getting very late, and he tried to impose some personal questions like, do you live far from the school? Is it a house or an apartment? Do you live with both your parents? There's 5 of you? You're not often home alone, right? I never answered because it was way too shady for me, and unfortunately for me, he didn't push the questions or insist. I say unfortunately because if he had, I would have just straight up blocked him. The next day the same thing, we chat a lot and he was still asking me plenty of personal questions to get to know me better. So I asked him some too. He always answered me with what seemed like honesty. I still didn't answer the questions about my house though, because he didn't need to know that. It lasted 2 or 3 weeks, but it was enough for me to develop feelings for him. He was handsome, kind, and it was everything I needed. Because I was bullied for years and still am today, and still developed strong feelings, but most importantly blind trust in people who are friendly to me. In France, in October, we have a 2-week vacation, and the day before I had to go back to school, he finally told me he was coming to my high school because he finally moved in with his mum, and he asked me to meet him at a place during morning break. I was happy and relieved to be able to meet him, and told him to join me in the hall. But when he understood that there would be people around, he said he would prefer an isolated location, because he was afraid he would not recognize me, and didn't want me to spend the break looking for him. It was a good excuse for me, so I told him to meet me in the 3rd floor bathroom, because we weren't allowed to stay there during the breaks, so no one would disturb us. In my head, even though it was a little bit creepy, I still was in the school, so nothing could happen to me. The next day, back to school, I made myself pretty, wore my best clothes, and I counted down the minutes and finally, when break time arrived, ran to the bathroom and waited. And when he arrived, it was him. He was not a catfish. He looked quite like his profile picture, but I still noticed that he seemed a little bit older than he told me. I thought perhaps he was 20 instead of 17. We talked a lot. We got along well. I was so pleased, and at the end of the break he asked me to go with him to the fast food for lunch. I said no because I didn't have any money, and I always refused for people to pay for me as principal. He seemed somewhat disappointed but offered to walk me home after class. I explained that I needed to take the bus, but that he could walk me to the bus stop. He looked disappointed again but finally accepted. And that was exactly what happened. And it was so great that it quickly became some kind of routine. We met on the 3rd floor bathroom during the morning break. He walked me to the bus stop after classes. Surprising fact, I never saw him in the hallway nor the cafeteria, but I thought at the time that the building was huge, as there were over 1,500 students in here, so if our schedules didn't coincide, there was no way we would meet each other. This little game lasted until December, so almost a month and a half. Then on the 14th of December, a Thursday, I complained about how lonely I was going to be that evening because my dad was abroad for work, my brother was always at his friend's house, and my little sister was on a school trip, and my mum had to work late that evening. It was very reckless of me, but after weeks I thought I could trust him. That evening he walked me to the bus stop. We both waited and I got on the bus. I waved at him and put on my headphones. I had 2 stops before my house, and it was about 5:45 in December, so already really dark outside. As I got off the bus, I had a really bad feeling. There was a really uncomfortable sensation in my stomach and I felt like I was being watched. I put my music on pause but kept my earphones on so that people thought I couldn't hear, and that's what probably saved my life. I lived in a suburban neighborhood, very silent especially at night, with no visibility on the big road. The bus passed in. When I heard footsteps behind me, I understood I was right. There was someone following me, and he was not with good intentions. At least I could hear that he was not accelerating, so he was not trying to catch me up, but I couldn't guess how long it lasted. As quietly as possible, I tried to reach for my keys in my pocket, and when I finally pulled them out, I ran as fast as I could. I did the best sprint of my life and don't even know how it worked, but I managed to open and close the door before he could reach me. I then deactivated my alarm, which by the way confirmed that I was home alone, and took a look through the glass panel on the door, not the peephole, the whole window, so that if someone wants to see what's happening inside, they can. It was Rob, a few meters away, looking at me with a really creepy face. He followed me home, probably with a car, and was clearly not there for chit-chat. I still don't know why, but I didn't call the police. I was totally paralyzed. We were both staring at each other for a minute, and when I took back control of my body, I ran to the kitchen to get a knife. And when I got back to the door, he was there too, banging against it. I'd feared for a second the glass would break, but it didn't. That moment, when I was pushing against the door, praying for it not to break while he was kicking harder and harder, was the longest time I've ever experienced. When he finally stopped and got around the house, he began knocking against all the shutters and got back to the door. He looked angry, but then my neighbor's car reached my home and Rob ran away, probably thinking it was my mum. On Twitter, Rob sent me 1,000 messages before I blocked him. He then deleted his account, and I thought I was done. But quickly after, some accounts which had just been created began following me. Their @ were all a series of numbers with the first letter of his name, and as soon as I blocked one, another one followed me too. At this point I chose to delete my account, because I couldn't make it stop, and it was too hard to endure, because they were sending me dozens and upon dozens of insulting DMs. Later I spoke to the people who were supposed to be Rob's classmates, because I hadn't met him again in days, but not a single one had ever heard of Rob. This guy was never a student in my high school. That's why I'd never met him, apart from our daily meetings, and that's probably why he seemed so old. I'd never heard about him anymore, and I still ask myself, what did he want? What could have happened that night? Rob? Let's never meet again.
Many years ago, I met up with a girl I knew from high school called Sandy. She was more of an acquaintance back then, and we were never intimate. Even though we hung around with different groups of friends, I remember she once invited me to a party at her house, but nothing ever evolved past that. In fact, I met my high school girlfriend Andrea at that very party. It had been several years since graduation, and I met her on the street. We chatted a bit, and to make a long story short, I ended up at her place that night. Following a glass or two of wine, we ended up doing it on the bed in the living room. Nothing extraordinary, but it was okay. And after a few minutes, she got out of bed and shuffled to the kitchen, which was located at the far end of the living room. I was still in bed, but glanced over in a groggy post-coitus haze. She entered the kitchen and flipped the light on. This is when things get weird. First of all, the kitchen light must have been an old ceiling fixture with those long fluorescent tubes. It kicked on with a loud groan like an old arc welder. The light that came blasting out of the kitchen was a god-awful wavelength of intense radiation that bleached everything in its path. While the rest of the living room was still dark, the doorway to the kitchen had this weird glow, and the noise from the fixture didn't help matters. This brought me to my senses somewhat, but as time passed, an intuition that something was wrong hit me. At first, I thought I heard a hushed conversation in the kitchen. I don't know if Sandy had a roommate, but being butt naked, I instantly grabbed my clothes. Another minute had passed, and because there were no footsteps or the usual awkward peek around the corner, I figured she must have been on the phone. The hushed conversation in the kitchen started growing louder, and it sounded like Sandy was having a tight-lipped argument with someone on the phone. This made me rather uncomfortable, so I got out of bed and stealthily put my clothes on. Now roughly 5 minutes had passed and I was dressed,
and I sat on the side of the bed trying to listen in and figure out what was going on. My phone theory disappeared when I thought I heard two enraged voices. The problem was that they were both unmistakably coming from Sandy. I started thinking about bailing for the front door. The kitchen meltdown took a drastic turn as I heard sounds of a cutlery drawer being slammed open. Panic set in when the unmistakable clang sound of metal on metal began. I started scanning the dark living room for a weapon, and then all grew insanely quiet. The light went out, but not without making a final groan before the darkness. I followed the sound of footsteps out of the kitchen and across the living room. I froze. While Sandy walked up to me with a smile on her face, I was looking at her empty hands. Even though they were empty, I was crapping myself. Her voice reverted back to the calm and sweet one. She asked, "Do you really have to go?" I lied and told her I got dressed because she sounded busy. I really didn't know what else to say to her. I noped out of there as best I could under the circumstances and never heard from her again. A few months ago, I met another female classmate. Curious, I told her that I bumped into Sandy not too long ago. And she says, "Oh, poor Sandy. I heard that she was released a while back." What? So I uttered an, "Oh, really?" "Oh, yeah. She was institutionalized shortly after high school. Complete breakdown." I tried creating distance by saying we were only acquaintances, and I remembered her from that party at her house. "Oh, that party. I'm not sure if anyone ever told you this, but she had planned at that party for months in advance to try and snare you. Unfortunately, Andrea beat her to it." Thank God for Facebook. I'm now married and in a faraway state. No class reunions for me, though. Ever. Sandy ended up fine. Recently went back to school and has a professional position. Good for her. But class reunions are still out of the question, though. I have been divorced for several years now, but not by choice. My now ex-wife Julia ended our marriage apparently out of the blue, citing claims of infidelity. There's just one problem. I never cheated on her. In fact, I was positively in love with her. My affections for her never dwindled in the least. I wasn't prone to spending a disproportionate amount of time at work or with friends, so I had given her no reason to think I was being unfaithful. Truthfully, she was a wolf in sheep's clothing. Unfortunately, it took a messy divorce for me to see her true colors. The divorce court judge believed her adultery allegations uncritically, giving her everything she needed to wreck me financially and leave me with nothing. I considered pursuing custody of our 2 children, but I dropped the case when she threatened to accuse me of child abuse and molestation. Once she made that threat, I knew I had no chance of winning. The family court judge would have believed her just as easily and unquestioningly as the divorce court judge. So now I'm living in a 2-room apartment, needing to work 2 jobs to make ends meet, thanks to alimony and child support payments. And I get to see my son and daughter every 3rd or 4th Saturday. And frankly, I'm fortunate it's even that frequent. She's interfered with my visitation rights multiple times with full backing of the courts, and I dare not protest should she try to play the molester card. Some months ago, she started allowing them to come over to my place every other weekend. That's when I began to notice some problems. My son had a bruise and cut on his arm. I asked him what happened, and he shrugged it off by saying that he got into a fight at school. The next time I saw them, my daughter also had a bruise, and she used the same excuse as my son. That's when I started to grow worried. Both of my kids getting into fights at school within a couple of weeks of each other. I mean, it's not impossible, but I never really bought it. Over the next few months, I began to notice other problems. Their clothing began to look worn and exceedingly dirty, and both of them had noticeably lost weight. This didn't make sense to me.
My ex was getting more than enough money from me in terms of child support. There was no reason for my kids to be looking like this. I tried asking my son and daughter what was going on, but neither of them would say much. This raised some red flags. I couldn't afford a private investigator at that point, when fortunately a friend of mine who was far better off financially agreed to help me out. So I asked him to install a security camera for my apartment. When I asked why, I told him, "Something tells me I might be needing one soon." After a few weeks, the private detective met with me and my friend at my apartment, and the information he provided us was upsetting to say the least. He had numerous photographs of my ex meeting with shady characters in out-of-the-way places, purchasing drugs. In some of the photos, my ex was shown walking out of shopping malls with new shoes and very expensive clothing. She had been using my child support checks for anything but supporting our children. The last 2 photos were taken from outside the house, and the detective got clear shots of my ex with raised fists while my children were in a defensive position and sobbing. So much for the claims that they were getting into fights at school. He told me one more thing, that my ex might have spotted him at one point or may have noticed him a little earlier and got suspicious. He couldn't say for sure. Whatever the case, I had the dirt on this loathsome witch, and I was going to expose her. Later that same night, I was woken up by a persistent ringing on my doorbell. I stumbled to my front door and opened it up. It was my ex-wife. She looked like she was ready to shoot lasers from her eyes. If looks could kill, I would have died from a heart attack on the spot. But I kept my composure. "What the hell do you want at this hour?" "You hired someone to follow me, didn't you? To take pictures of me?" "Oh, so you saw him, huh?" I said, taking a measure of sadistic pleasure at making her realize she was screwed. "What the hell did you do that for?" "I had my reasons. Whatever the case, I've got the goods on you. Your ass is going to prison, and you're never going to be seeing the kids again, not if I have anything to say about it." She stood there silent for a few seconds, her rage seething. "If I can't have them, neither will you." Suddenly she pulled a knife. I reacted a little too late, and she stabbed me in the shoulder. I stumbled back into my apartment with her trying to plunge the knife deeper. I shook her off, but she took a slashing motion and got me in the arm, leaving an ugly gash. I grabbed my living room lamp and tossed it at her. It struck her in the head, and she was out cold. The police arrived, and I told them everything. My ex had regained consciousness by the time and tried to play the victim, saying that I was being rough with her and she only stabbed me in self-defense. I told the cops I had a security camera, and it would prove my side of the story. I knew I had made the right call having it installed. My ex got a pretty hefty prison sentence, combining her illicit drug use, neglect, and physical abuse of the children, as well as her attempted murder of me. She would be old and grey by the time they let her out. I couldn't immediately take in my children due to previous financial ruin, but the court agreed to grant me full custody once I got back on my feet. For now, my kids are staying with my parents, but when the time comes, I look forward to rebuilding my relationship with them. This happened back on Christmas Eve in 1999, when I was 12 years old. My parents were away at a Christmas party and planned not to return till late, probably after midnight. So it was just me and my brother John, who was 16 at the time. I was a dumb kid who still believed that Santa was real. Approaching midnight, I decided to go to bed. Just about 3 hours after, I hear a knock at the front door. I thought it was my parents coming back from the party, or perhaps Santa. But then I thought and realized something. I was like, Santa comes through the chimney, not the front door. And couldn't my parents just open the garage and come in? My parents never ever tell anyone who is outside our family what the garage code is. Plus nobody else but them were expected to come to the house for the night. I decided to just ignore it. At least 5 minutes later, I hear a knocking noise again.
This time I decide to check who the hell is knocking at 3 a.m. I made sure to check the front door from the window to the kitchen, so that whoever was knocking on the door could see me. The kitchen window that I was viewing from was across left of where the door was, so you could only see the person's right side if they were facing the door. From what I could see, there was a man dressed up as Santa Claus, but I was not able to see his face due to the fact that he was facing the front of the door. He then suddenly turned around to face me. He seemed to be somewhere between his early 50s to late 40s. He was grinning a massive, creepy grin, and then said, "Merry Christmas, Joseph. I have some presents down here for you. Why don't you come and open the door and let good old Saint Nick give them to you?" I was scared and said nothing. Then he started to jiggle the doorknob to get in. I quickly walked to my brother's bedroom to alert him about the fake Santa Claus. He was grumpy that I had woken him up, and when we went to check, there was no one there. He accused me of dreaming. "Go back to bed, Joe." He is." "No buts." He was annoyed. I went back to bed but couldn't go back to sleep. Then I heard it again. This time I ran down the stairs, busted into my brother's room and screamed that he was still there. Angry now that I could not go back to sleep, me and him walked up the stairs and looked at the kitchen window. But this time we both saw him and he was like, "Oh my, you're right, Joe. Sorry I didn't believe you." We hid in my bedroom as he dialed 911. The police said that they would be there as soon as possible. 8 to 10 minutes later, no noise was made and it was all quiet. I was about to ask my brother if he thought the creep was gone when all of a sudden we heard a window break. We quickly looked at each other in horror as we realized the creep had broken the window to get in. We heard boots approaching my bedroom and the words, "Joseph, where are you? I have a Christmas present for you. Come see St. Nicholas," which freaked both of us out. There were blue and red and white flashing lights and the police were finally here. It felt like forever. He tried to escape from the window he broke through, but the police caught him. The window he broke was the kitchen window that I was looking out of. The man was a convicted rapist who had done something terrible to a 12-year-old boy just a few blocks away. After that, my parents never went to another holiday party. The following stories are all true and have been passed down through my family. My grandmother's mother was a terrible person, according to her anyway. She never really wanted to talk about her. When they were young, they lived in a small shack in Arkansas. I have a picture somewhere. It's a small 2 or 3 bedroom house in the middle of nowhere, as most houses were in those days. When Grandma did talk about her mother, she referred to her as a witch. She would have people over at strange times of the night, doing strange things to them in her room. One night, my grandma and her sisters and her brother were sitting in the main room, and her mother was in her room, doing things with some people, when her grandmother screamed at the top of her lungs and the door to the room slammed open. My grandmother's grandmother, who had died a few weeks prior, stepped through the door, only her features were distorted. She looked like a cartoon character version of her grandmother. She moved across the room quickly and grabbed my grandmother, then maybe 8 years old. She grabbed her by the hand and said, "Come with me," and tried to drag her to the front door. Her mother, now standing at the door to her room, screamed at my grandmother to not go with her. And that was not her grandmother. There may have been more to that event, but my grandmother wasn't very good at finishing stories. There was another occasion where my grandmother's mother sold her to another person when she was a kid, but she never actually told us that story. She just mentioned that it had happened. The old house my mum used to live in, when my mother was young, she left home for a short time to go live with her sister who had gotten married. They lived in a farmhouse in McMinnville, Oregon.
The house was an old, white, two-story thing sitting in a wheat field on the edge of a forest. I actually lived there for a short time myself in another house built near the spot of the old house. The house would always make weird creaking noises. You'd hear people walking around the house when no one else was there, or you'd hear voices. Animals would go inside the house. Cats, dogs, they had them all, but not a single animal would set foot inside the house itself. You would see people walking down the hallways, but no one would be there. Standard scary stuff, I suppose. In the room my mother was occupying, she always thought there was something strange about it. She thought that there was too much room between her room and the one next to it, like there was a space between the rooms, but there wasn't anything there, seemingly. Eventually, my aunt and her husband ripped that house down to build a new one. And when they were taking the house down, between my mum's room and the other room, there was a small hallway that led to a small room or closet. There was an old chair in there facing the wall, with a large demonic painting of Satan just hanging there. They burned the remaining bits of the house after that. Years later, I actually went to live in the house that they constructed just about 20 feet from the foundation of the old one. And other than falling out of bed one night, nothing strange ever really happened there. However, they have since torn down that house and bought a manufactured home, double wide, which now sits on the foundation of the original house, and weird stuff began to happen there, so take from that what you will. My grandmother, who I don't take as a liar for once, also told me about the time she was walking to school one day with her siblings when they came upon a large snake crossing the road. Her brother picked up a rock and threw it at the snake, and it shattered into a bunch of little pieces as if it were made of glass, but then continued on its way like nothing had happened. It wasn't until much later, when the internet was a thing, that I looked up shatter snake and found out it's actually a thing. And now, the story about the thing in the attic. This one actually happened to me, and looking back, it's entirely possible that I'm seeing this through the lens of an overactive imagination, and that all that I thought I saw I didn't see. But there's physical evidence too to back up some of it, so it's hard for me to be entirely certain what actually went down. I suppose I'll leave this down to you. When I was very young, I lived on a street in Fresno, California called Villa. The house we moved into instantly became awesome when the people who moved out left behind a frigging castle of Grayskull in the garage. So for me, the house was cool, but for my sisters, not so much. At night, my eldest sister would hear something walking around the attic, just in her room, alone. I never heard anything above my room, but she constantly said she could hear what sounded like footsteps and scratching just above her bed and around in various parts of the room. My little sister sometimes heard it, but not as frequently. One night, so as to call her bluff, I slept in her bed in her room and she slept in mine. The night was going fine. I didn't hear or see anything the entire time. I just lay awake in her bed. So finally, I went to sleep. Sometime in the early hours of the morning, I woke up to something clunking just above my head. It sounded like something walking around in the attic, but there was a distinct scratchy after sound like it was dragging around or something. It scared the living hell out of me, and I ran into my parents' room. Fast forward a few months. Kittens were born, and everyone was happy to play with them. Well, one day we came home. In the vent just above the front door, that vents air from the attic, there was a kitten, with its head pressed against the vent, mewing its head off, like it was scared out of its mind. So my dad gets a chair from the kitchen and puts it in my sister's closet, because of course the door to the attic has to be in her closet. But he's too big to fit in it, so the burden falls on me. He gives me a lighter and I climb up to get on the chair, and then onto the shelf, into the closet, and poke my head up into the attic to try and get this cat. So there I am, with the top part of my body fully exposed in the attic. I'm careful not to look behind me over the area that is my sister's room. I look straight ahead to the front door area and to the kitchen. I try and try to get the kitten to come to me. I call to the kitten and I hold out my hand, but it's afraid of me. Finally, after a long time, I get the kitten to come close enough to grab it, and without thinking I turn around to sit on the shelf that I was previously kneeling on, and turn to face the area of the attic that extends over my sister's room, which is where I come face to face with what I can only describe as a very large dog-like creature kneeling over and almost face to face with me. It isn't moving, it's not making a sound, it's not even breathing as far as I can tell. It doesn't blink, it doesn't do anything, it just stares at me. At this point I'm flipping the hell out. I drop the kitten from the attic, straighten my body, and fall out of the attic just in time to hear something up there make a loud crashing sound. I ran as fast as my feet would carry me out of the front door and refused to enter the house again, and spent the next 2 weeks at my grandma's apartment. No one believed me, except my sisters, and my dad went up there to see what was in the attic and found nothing. Months later, I had forgotten entirely about the incident. My mum, sisters, and I are out and about at the store, and my dad was sitting on the couch cleaning and loading his handgun, drunk, because he's a genius like that, and accidentally fires a shot into the ceiling. He hears what he describes as a half screech/howl of pain and a loud crash in my sister's room. Some brown dog-like creature comes tearing ass down the hallway towards him and enters the living room. The front door is open, and it bolts out the front door. My mother, sisters, and I return home to the story. The broken porthole in my sister's closet with scratch marks on the walls and closet trim, and the neighbors saying they saw something weird run out of the house and down the street. And that's it. I've certainly experienced my fair share of the creepy, and thank you all for listening. In high school, I had a stalker. Here's the story. I was 16 and we met on Facebook. He went to a school nearby, and we decided to meet up for a movie. We had a great time together and ended up dating. First time he came to my parents' house, he had an ankle monitor on for house arrest, and wouldn't tell anyone why. Red flag number 1. And since he was a minor, we couldn't find out. My parents obviously didn't allow us to hang out, so we hung out at his house or around town, at the YMCA camp. I was rebellious and naive. Things started to get weird when I noticed his family was pretty odd. One day we were doing it in his bedroom, and I saw his father looking in through the blinds. I screamed and called him out, and his dad ran off. The stalker guy told me that his dad was just into redheads and liked to watch us, so this wasn't the first time. I went to leave, and his mum was doing crack in the kitchen, so I decided it was time to break up, and this is when things got bad. He started crying and told me that he's in cancer treatment, and that's why he needs me. He doesn't have long to live. I believed him and told him we could be friends. This is when the stalking started. He switched schools to my high school, but never went to class. He would just stand outside my classroom looking inside until it was passing period. When I would leave class, he wouldn't address me. He would just follow, about 10 to 15 feet behind me to my next period, and stand outside the classroom again. I was too intimidated to say something to him, as he was 6'4" and heavy set, so I just let it happen for a few weeks. It started to progress when he would follow me home every day. He would get on the same bus as me, despite living across town,
and walk 10 to 15 feet behind me all the way to my house. He would stand outside, just staring up at the window until around the time my parents got home, and then he would just leave. Finally, I told him to piss off and leave me alone. I told him we could no longer be friends or acquaintances or anything, and to forget about me. However, that escalated things way further. I started getting about 150 calls a night. Half of them were him screaming death threats and in detail torture methods that he wanted to do to me, and the other half were him singing me love songs that he wrote on his guitar. Every time I blocked his number, he seemed to just magically get a new one and leave more messages on that. I woke up one day to see that overnight he had left me one of these dancing, singing snowmen on my porch. He had stabbed it in the head, and the knife was sticking out. He covered it in his liquid deodorant that I had previously mentioned liking the smell of, and I noticed that there was a hole where the little song recording device was. When I pressed the hand, it was not the regular Frosty the Snowman song that played. It was his voice singing eerily, "I'm gonna have you forever. I'm never gonna let you go." I was done at this point and told my parents, who contacted the school. They suspended him, but he still waited at my bus stop every day and walked to my home with me. One day he ran at me, like he was gonna tackle me. When I tensed up for the impact, he stopped and hugged me. It wasn't a regular hug, it was like he was trying to crush me. I was 5'1" and about 90 pounds at the time, and he ended up cracking one of my ribs. I cried and he started crying too before running off, and he left me a voicemail apologizing in song. This one night is the night I'll never forget, and it's the reason why we got a restraining order and my dad got a gun. I woke up one evening for no reason. I was just fully awake. I got up to go to my kitchen to get a glass of water and relax, and in the reflection on my fridge I saw movement in the backyard. I couldn't see well because it was so dark outside and so light inside, so I went to the back sliding glass door to get a better look. When I got closer, I was met with the silhouette of a 6'4" man standing just outside the door. The stalker guy was standing in my backyard under my room at 3 a.m. He was just staring at me. I yelled at my parents and got them up, but of course he was gone by the time my dad got outside. There's a patio right outside my bedroom window that goes all the way around to the ground, so it's possible he could have been on top of the patio looking directly into my bedroom window before. We got a restraining order granted shortly after, and Stalker Guy dropped out of school. I haven't seen him in person, but every 6 months-ish, he makes a new Facebook and tries to friend request me. I block and report it every time. Have you ever heard that myth that if you wake up in the middle of the night for no reason, there's likely someone looking at you? Well, maybe it's true. My campus wasn't even that old, though it did used to be a tuberculosis ward, and I've heard people saying some weird stuff about it. I'll preface this by saying that nothing specifically happened to me, other than one kind of thing. Let me get into it. My freshman year here, I lived in a brand new dorm. Like these had opened for actual students for the very first time, so there was no reason for anyone to think these were haunted. Fast forward maybe a month or so, and my roommate comes up to me and asks me if anything weird has happened to me. Of course I'm like, nah. But she's really upset, and basically tells me she thinks she's being haunted. She claims some weird stuff would happen, and one day she came back, and though her room was locked, she found these little knickknacks she had all around her room lined up on her bed. She also said when hanging out with her friend, one of them heard someone whisper their name, and the other told them to knock it off. Q realizing that the other had never actually said anything. She also said she had a really alarming dream she mistook for reality, where she was in her dorm room and felt like she was being watched. She said she looked up and there was a cute guy, and she was like, "Oh, hi," all flirty, then realized at some point that this guy was off. So she said, "Well, tell me you love God," and his face immediately turned to a scowl and he huffed, "You shouldn't have said that." And it got really scary until she woke up, but was in the exact same position she'd been in the dream,
with all the lights on. Now, I should also acknowledge here that my roommate wasn't partially religious at the time, and I hadn't known her very long. But she's probably one of the most level-headed people I've met. She's not a dreamy airhead. She was like the president or VP of college Republicans on campus. And, okay, political commentary aside, she was really serious and factual, and super into politics, not the kind of person you would think would make up silly stuff. But these first few months I knew her, she was like invisible tears, and would refuse to come back and live in the dorms. She'd spend all of her time at the library, and was so upset she even asked my Wiccan friend what to do. Of course, since I'm a paranormal too spooky nerd, I of course was like, you have to be firm and tell whatever it is to get the hell out, which she did. This roommate after this became very religious. Eventually stuff seemed to settle down for her, but not before a few weird things happened. One of the roomies reported nothing, while the other, who was a bit dramatic and could have made stuff up, reported her angel statue would keep twisting in the night to face away from her. The only thing that happened to me that was strange was the day before Christmas break upon returning. I walked near, but not touching my mirror, and it fell over it shattered. I didn't think this was possible because it was a cheap, crappy Walmart mirror, and it was just leaning against the wall, so long that it kind of caved into it. I didn't even think it could break. I thought it was plastic or something, and it could have fallen at any time, so I thought it was weird that it decided to fall and shatter when I walked like a foot past it. I mean, it was probably nothing, right? People on the 4th floor reported that their stuff would go missing, and locked windows would suddenly open, pissing some people off when stuff got snowed on, and they thought it was their roommates who opened it. People found their keys in places that they looked. Some people also said they supposedly saw 2 spirits, one large shadow figure they thought was a large man, and a little girl. They said the little girl was supposedly the one who liked to hide stuff, and I think some dumbasses used a Ouija board and claimed the shadow figure was a guardian or something. Nobody believes anything else that happened because of mob mentality. But one time after hearing my roommate's experience, the entire 4th floor ended up cramming into my dorm to hear my roommate talk about it. The one particularly disturbing story I heard came from a guy down the hall. He told me he'd never had any recurring dreams before, but after moving here, he had the same one 7 nights in a row. I'll skip some details because since it was involved, but in the dream he moved into a house with his dream girlfriend. He was single at the time. He would end up hearing a scream at some point that was always a false alarm, and leave the house for a while, and when he'd return he'd find her facing away from him with scissors in her hand. Into every surface of the house, he said the words, "It'll be all right," were carved deeply, and when she turned around, she proceeded to violently murder herself with the scissors, and he'd be forced to watch for a while before waking up. The thing he said that rattled him the most was that "it would be all right." The phrase etched into every surface was basically what his personal life philosophy boiled down to, and he said that it felt as though it were mocking him. I don't know. Take this with a grain of salt, but this is from a few years ago. I also have another story that my other roommate from the same school told me that happened to her. Basically, she lived in a completely separate dorm, one that wasn't, I think, typically considered haunted or anything. My school does do occasional ghost tours in October because even the staff there are like, yeah, okay, something's weird. Her story boils down to that she heard scratching in her dorm a lot, coming from the bathroom, and growling as if there were a dog, but there was no dog there. She has claimed to see 2 full-body apparitions. One, she said, was out of the corner of her eye, a woman in a hospital gown facing away from her, while the other, the one that really freaks her out, there was an apparition of a guy that really freaked her out. I can't remember most of what she said happened, but they kind of knew he was around. He supposedly had some sort of attachment to my roommate, and most noticeably acted out when she and her other roommate were preparing to leave. According to my roommate, her other roomie was talking to her late while packing, and suddenly got super pale and insisted they both leave. When they got out, her roomie said she saw the guy standing behind her, with the most hostile expression she'd ever seen. My roommate says she has a feeling this guy was about our age, and she thinks maybe he ended his own life, but she could never find any information on who he actually was. She always described him very clearly as wearing this particular sort of sweater, sort of maybe 80s style, with a distinctly separate colour section. The roommate is also very level-headed, and I've never known her to lie, and is one of the chillest people I've ever met. She also knows the cops on campus and told me, supposedly, one time they got a call about a woman down by the older buildings on staff doing rounds, thinking she was lost or suspicious, and cops went down, and I can't remember what, but she said she saw this woman in like an old-timey blue dress that then vanished when they got closer, and it seriously freaked them out. When I was 19, I was still living with my family, as well as working 2 jobs to save up money. 1 food service and 1 retail. I was also extremely depressed. I had been sexually assaulted the year prior and was still taking everything really hard. How I very poorly dealt with my depression was sleeping around, drinking, and a whole lot of weed. I stopped counting who I was sleeping with once my body count hit the 40s. One of the ways I got my hookups was through a very popular BDSM website. I was casually chatting with a guy called Charlie. We met in a public park, and even though he was a little strange, he didn't seem dangerous. I made it very clear from the get-go that I didn't want anything serious whatsoever, strictly friends with benefits. I also kept him around because he was 27 and bought me booze with my money. After a few weeks of this, he admitted to me he was autistic, which didn't bother me in the slightest, because I'd met many people on the spectrum who functioned like normal members of society. Everything was going relatively okay, until I found out that some of my co-workers knew him. The ones who knew him were all around the same age, so it of course didn't surprise me. But naturally I was curious and asked around what people knew of him. My boss, who knew him, simply said he was strange. A co-worker in a differing department said he gave her super creepy vibes all through high school. And one of my co-workers, who I saw almost every other shift, said that Charlie was almost always actively trying to break him up and his boyfriend. I thought it was super strange, didn't know he was bi, didn't really care. I confronted Charlie about it, and he told me some half-truths about how he had a crush on my co-worker. I told them to leave them alone because they were newly engaged. Over these 2 months, I met a guy through my food service job who I really liked. His name was Beck, and because I liked Beck a lot, I started distancing myself from Charlie. Well, of course, he doesn't like this and starts giving off some red flags. Charlie told me he was almost positive he was schizophrenic. I told him that even though I was a psych major, I was no way near being qualified enough to help him, nor did I really want to. But I encouraged him to find help, and even recommended my own therapist or her husband. He told me he already went to both of them for psychiatric care when he was 15, and they both diagnosed him with antisocial personality disorder, psychopathy, and dismissed him. I inquired to my therapist about the last time she or her husband diagnosed someone, specifically a minor with APD. She said that neither of them had ever, as it was pretty rare. And I confronted Charlie about his lying, and he denied ever doing so. He continued to try and talk to me about his mental health, which I didn't mind listening to, but I wasn't qualified or let alone licensed to give advice on other than seek help. Charlie then dropped the bomb that he wholeheartedly believed he was a 300-year-old Nazi vampire who killed Jewish infants during World War II in a past life. I tell him he needs to seek serious help if he's having these thoughts and false memories. Charlie also said he'd been having dreams about my parents' dogs tearing him apart, and that he had also had dreams about murdering me. My body kind of kicked into survival mode, so I faked getting a phone call from my parents to have an excuse to leave. I cut off all contacts with him shortly after, at the advice of my now boyfriend, Beck, as well as my parents. I am now also in the process of moving in with him, and I was going to have to break it off with Charlie anyhow. Charlie constantly sent text messages and leaves numerous voicemails, but I only ever had the idea to record one of them, in which he begs me to stay,
and to not leave him behind, like my retail co-worker did. Things go a little quiet for a few days, and I think he's finally given up, until one evening at my food service job, he shows up. I immediately took off my gloves and ran into the back room. My boss follows me, and basically asks me what the hell is going on, because I'm doing this in the middle of a rush. I tell him a very, very condensed story of what's happening, and beg him to let me stay in the back and work instead. I can tell he's skeptical, but lets me stay in the back as long as I work. I tell Beck to let him know what's going on, and he hauls ass to my job. While talking to Beck, 2 of my co-workers were helping Charlie with his order, when he said, "I know Lily's in the back hiding from me." He paid for his food, leaves, and my co-workers tell me it's safe. Beck is outside waiting for him, and tells him very firmly without threatening that I didn't want to see him anymore for any reason. Charlie tries saying that he only came there for the food. Beck tells him there's another restaurant like this downtown. Beck made sure I'm okay and then left. When I return home, I tell my parents what's happening, and they tell me to get a restraining order. Beck and my retail co-workers came with me to the police station to file the report. My uncle, a retired lawyer, gets in contact with an old friend who will be my counsel. My uncle, my lawyer, and Charlie's lawyer all talk and come to an agreement that if Charlie never talks to me or comes to my place of work ever again, I will drop all charges. But if he doesn't abide by the restriction, he will be tried and likely lose, since I have numerous witnesses and video evidence to back me up. The ending is slightly anticlimactic, but he does as he's told. So yeah, that was my unfortunate stalking experience. When I was 19, I was still living with my family, as well as working 2 jobs to save up money. 1 food service and 1 retail. I was also extremely depressed. I had been sexually assaulted the year prior and was still taking everything really hard. How I very poorly dealt with my depression was sleeping around, drinking, and a whole lot of weed. I stopped counting who I was sleeping with once my body count hit the 40s. One of the ways I got my hookups was through a very popular BDSM website. I was casually chatting with a guy called Charlie. We met in a public park, and even though he was a little strange, he didn't seem dangerous. I made it very clear from the get-go that I didn't want anything serious whatsoever, strictly friends with benefits. I also kept him around because he was 27 and bought me booze with my money. After a few weeks of this, he admitted to me he was autistic, which didn't bother me in the slightest, because I'd met many people on the spectrum who functioned like normal members of society. Everything was going relatively okay, until I found out that some of my co-workers knew him. The ones who knew him were all around the same age, so it of course didn't surprise me. But naturally I was curious and asked around what people knew of him. My boss, who knew him, simply said he was strange. A co-worker in a differing department said he gave her super creepy vibes all through high school. And one of my co-workers, who I saw almost every other shift, said that Charlie was almost always actively trying to break him up and his boyfriend. I thought it was super strange, didn't know he was bi, didn't really care. I confronted Charlie about it, and he told me some half-truths about how he had a crush on my co-worker. I told them to leave them alone because they were newly engaged. Over these 2 months, I met a guy through my food service job who I really liked. His name was Beck, and because I liked Beck a lot, I started distancing myself from Charlie. Well, of course, he doesn't like this and starts giving off some red flags. Charlie told me he was almost positive he was schizophrenic. I told him that even though I was a psych major, I was no way near being qualified enough to help him, nor did I really want to. But I encouraged him to find help, and even recommended my own therapist or her husband. He told me he already went to both of them for psychiatric care when he was 15,
and they both diagnosed him with antisocial personality disorder, psychopathy, and dismissed him. I inquired to my therapist about the last time she or her husband diagnosed someone, specifically a minor with APD. She said that neither of them had ever, as it was pretty rare, and I confronted Charlie about his lying, and he denied ever doing so. He continued to try and talk to me about his mental health, which I didn't mind listening to, but I wasn't qualified or let alone licensed to give advice on other than seek help. Charlie then dropped the bomb that he wholeheartedly believed he was a 300-year-old Nazi vampire who killed Jewish infants during World War II in a past life. I tell him he needs to seek serious help if he's having these thoughts and false memories. Charlie also said he'd been having dreams about my parents' dogs tearing him apart, and that he had also had dreams about murdering me. My body kind of kicked into survival mode, so I faked getting a phone call from my parents to have an excuse to leave. I cut off all contacts with him shortly after, at the advice of my now boyfriend, Beck, as well as my parents. I am now also in the process of moving in with him, and I was going to have to break it off with Charlie anyhow. Charlie constantly sent text messages and leaves numerous voicemails, but I only ever had the idea to record one of them, in which he begs me to stay and to not leave him behind, like my retail co-worker did. Things go a little quiet for a few days, and I think he's finally given up, until one evening at my food service job he shows up. I immediately took off my gloves and ran into the back room. My boss follows me and basically asks me what the hell's going on, because I'm doing this in the middle of a rush. I tell him a very, very condensed story of what's happening and beg him to let me stay in the back and work instead. I can tell he's skeptical, but lets me stay in the back as long as I work. I tell Beck to let him know what's going on, and he hauls ass to my job. While talking to Beck, two of my co-workers were helping Charlie with his order, when he said, "I know Lily's in the back hiding from me." He paid for his food, leaves, and my co-workers tell me it's safe. Beck is outside waiting for him, and tells him very firmly without threatening that I didn't want to see him anymore for any reason. Charlie tries saying that he only came there for the food. Beck tells him there's another restaurant like this downtown. Beck made sure I'm okay and then left. When I return home, I tell my parents what's happening, and they tell me to get a restraining order. Beck and my retail co-workers came with me to the police station to file the report. My uncle, a retired lawyer, gets in contact with an old friend who will be my counsel. My uncle, my lawyer, and Charlie's lawyer all talk and come to an agreement that if Charlie never talks to me or comes to my place of work ever again, I will drop all charges. But if he doesn't abide by the restriction, he will be tried and likely lose, since I have numerous witnesses and video evidence to back me up. The ending is slightly anticlimactic, but he does as he's told. So yeah, that was my unfortunate stalking experience. This was 3 years ago, and I started college down the country. I was 18 and on Tinder and had never actually met anyone from it, but would just swipe through guys to be nosy and see who was on it. I was swiping right on some, and about a half hour after, got a message from this guy, who according to his account, was roughly 20 kilometers away. We made some small talk, and it was awkward, and I stopped replying. A day later, I received a friend request for him from Facebook. Mind you, I have a common enough name, so it would have taken ages for him to find me. We had no mutual friends, and my Tinder photos are not on my Facebook page. The only thing I had on it was the university I was attending, so maybe that's how he found me, but I don't know. I then quickly got a follow request on Instagram, and he somehow found my Snapchat username. I don't even have my social media, and it's a variation of my full name with extra added vowels and an underscore. I was freaking out at this point. I messaged him asking how he found my full name, and he just replied, "I think we have a connection. I really want to get to know you better." I unmatched him, deleted my Tinder, and blocked the accounts he tried to add me on all social media. After that, it was quiet for a few months. I was staying in digs and was knuckling down as I had a lot of assignments from the get-go. This was towards the end of November. I had no assignments due for 2 weeks, so I decided to go out with some friends. One of my friends stayed in student accommodation and the other was commuting, so she was staying with the other friend. I decided to walk back to my digs, as my landlady would probably freak out if I wasn't home that morning, and I really wish I got a taxi instead. I walked back and was about 15 minutes from the local nightclub we were at. It was at 3 a.m., and I was at the front door of the house opening up. The door was annoying, as it had 2 different locks, and I had to pull the handle towards myself to help open it up. It's also tough when you're tipsy, and trying not to wake up the family you're staying with. As I finally unlocked the door, a dark car pulls into the housing estate I'm staying in. It's quite big, and has a big green area in the middle for children, or people playing with their dogs. The car comes towards me, so I quickly get inside and lock the door. The car pulls into the driveway of the house I'm staying in, and just sits there with the full headlights on. I'm there shaking and too afraid to move from crouched below the door, as there's frosted glass about halfway up. As I get the courage to go upstairs and look out my bedroom window to see who it is, the car pulls out the driveway and speeds off. A few days later, I get a new friend request off the creepy Tinder guy on a new Facebook profile, even though there were no pictures on the account, just the same name. I blocked it. It was enough. It even caused me to transfer universities the next year. Thankfully, I haven't heard anything since. I don't know if it was just bad timing, or if it was that creep on Tinder that sat in the driveway, but it was petrifying. If you take anything from this, be careful who you let on social media or dating apps, and what information you have up. I have been working at a restaurant for about 8 months now. My first job there was as a busser. I worked very hard and made a lot of friends, because I did favors for everyone. I would help other people do their job. I would come in early and stay late, and almost every day that I worked there, I would throw out all the garbage. Needless to say, it didn't take long for my managers to notice, and they started to promote me. After 3 months of working there, I became a coach for the new bussers that they would hire. This is when we met John. We had got a fresh crop of new bussers, and it was up to me to get them up to speed. John stood out from the rest only because of how absolutely terrible he was at doing his job. I mean, it's hard work, but it's very simple concepts, really. Pick up dirty dishes and plates and cups, throw away the garbage, wipe down seats and tables, then reset the table, and needless to say, he was very bad at this simple task, if he even attempted it at all. A lot of the time, he would just walk by dirty tables and ignore the mess until someone told him to bus it. I worked with him as much as I could, but he had a permanent scowl and "I'm too good for this job" air about him. It didn't take long for every one of our staff to hate this kid. It was to the point where people dreaded working the same shift as him. As for me, I knew he was terrible, but I'm a nice guy, and I knew that all I had to do was say the word and he would be gone. But instead, I figured he needed work like the rest of us. The final straw was about 2 months ago. Side note, our restaurant is the busiest sports bar in the state and would normally schedule 3 to 4 buses along with 3 to 4 hosts on a single night, but we would all split the tip money and walk out with around 80 to 100 each. That being said, I was bussing with John, who was terrible, and a new kid with no training, so I'm in overdrive work mode. I'm not talking to anyone and my feet are a blur. I'm bussing 10 tops in at about 1 minute flat down to the wood. The dishwasher is running slow, so I'm running to the back and starting washing silverware. Garbage starts piling up and I'm running a mountain of trash to the dump in record time, then right into mopping spills. I hadn't noticed at this point that the other buses were missing, so now my manager is on the floor helping me bus because I'm falling behind. I thought, screw it, we're crashing and burning, might as well find out what these guys are up to now. I check every nook and cranny of the restaurant, No one has seen these guys for the past 45 minutes. My manager is pissed at me, which really is the hardest part for me. So I was like, screw it, let me check in the parking lot. Lo and behold, I find John and the new kid smoking weed in between some cars. I grabbed the new kid by his shirt collar, took him aside, and I said, if you want to keep this job, get inside right now and help me out. Me and the new kid went inside, and John followed behind us. That night while closing, my managers asked me why I was slacking that night. I responded with explaining that John was distracting the new kid by trying to get him to smoke during our dinner rush, but the new kid knew better. I lied because I liked the new kid, and I thought he deserved a real shot like everyone else. The next day, Jay was fired, and everyone knew why. I got him fired. It's Christmas Eve, last night, and it was a normal Hispanic Christmas Eve, drinking, dancing, dominoes, and smoking cigars. It's about 10:45, and I am smashed. The only people standing at this point was my grandmother, who's a party machine, me along with my girlfriend, and my uncle and brothers, all down just chilling on the couch when I get a text. The area code was from my area, but I didn't recognize the number. I open up the text and see, hey bro, it's John. I'm a busser at, I was wondering if you're over 21. Yeah, I'm closer to 30 than I am 21. Oh cool, do you want to buy me a bottle? I'm not old enough yet. Sure, whatever, where you at? Oh, I'm just driving around. Text me your address, I'll come by and pick you up. It was at this point that I got really confused about who I was talking to. John got fired and I didn't know any other buses called John. The liquor store's on the corner of this street and this street. Nah man, your exact address, I'll swing by and get you. At this point the red flags were up now, and I was thinking of ways to end the conversation without looking like a dick. Hey John, I just googled all the liquor stores in the area. They're all closed up early for Christmas. Nah dude, I found a 24-hour one. I'm in your part of town, I'll pick you up. At this point, I was sobering up real quick. I didn't live anywhere near work. And I know that the John who used to work with me for 3 weeks had no clue where I lived, or so I thought. I showed my girlfriend the text and she agreed it was super creepy. And I called my friends from work and they confirmed there were no new buses named John, so it had to be the one they fired. Then the dude calls me up. Yo bro, let me come get you real quick. I know this place in this part of town that has a 24-hour store. Let me just call them up real quick, just to make sure that we don't waste the gas. Alright, call me right back. I hung up, blocked his number. Looking back on it, so many things could have gone wrong. I'm pretty sure he was out for some kind of petty vengeance, maybe more. But I'm glad I didn't find out. Certainly would have ruined Christmas. During college, I dated a fairly well-known and talented local musician named Tim. As horrible boyfriends tend to be in the beginning, he was a loving, attentive, charismatic, and seemingly normal partner. He made me mixtapes, cooked my favorite meals, and dedicated songs to me at open mic nights around town. I, young, foolish, naive, was deeply smitten by his mysterious, dark, and artistic allure. However, over the course of our year-long relationship, his mental health severely declined. He had the ability to appear lucid around normal and other people, but in private began suffering delusions, compulsive lying, and created art that focused on themes of murder. I was worried sick, and his condition was exhausting, but I did my best to be kind and understanding and supportive. I loved him, and believed that he shouldn't have to struggle with his mental illness alone. One time he vanished without a trace for a full day. I found his apartment empty, lights on, front door wide open, and phone on his nightstand. I took a few deep breaths and called all around the city for hours, before finally discovering he had been involuntarily checked into a mental hospital. I did my best to be strong for him, seeing him every day during his supervised visitation hour and bringing him his favorite books to pass the time, and holding him as he sobbed that it was all a mistake, that he didn't belong there. It was surreal to see my gentle, intelligent,
normal albeit depressed boyfriend, surrounded by visibly insane long-term psych ward patients. For real, this place was like something out of a horror movie. In retrospect, none of the staff ever told me the real reason why he was there, and I was too polite and naive to ask. Our relationship ended a few months later. I found undeniable evidence that he was cheating on me, and secretly relieved, confronted him. I told him to leave my apartment and never returned. He cracked. The gentle Tim I had known and loved melted away to reveal a new persona with dead wild animal eyes that threatened to kill himself with pills unless I took him back. But I was so extremely done that I called the police. They weren't much help, but Tim left. I blocked him everywhere and never contacted him again. But he left me insane voicemails from different numbers for weeks afterwards. I was relatively unshaken, and things returned to normal. I graduated, got a sweet job in the same cool college city, and 6 months later I woke up to concerned texts from mutual friends, saying that they didn't want to freak me out, but Tim was off his meds, clearly manic, and was posting a newly written song all over social media. His best friend, who hadn't been in touch since before the breakup, sent me an apology, along with a screenshot of the lyrics. That got my attention. I don't want to read them here because they'll lead you back to his Bandcamp, but the song was pretty explicit about my rape and murder, but in a sort of cleverly disguised way. It's catchy too, the bastard. I checked his profiles myself from a friend's account, and he was posting dozens and dozens of totally insane rambling statuses, most of them about me. They flip-flopped between flowery love and prose to murder imagery. His friends were reacting with concern, but a few egged him on, probably thinking he was just venting about his ex. I decided that it would be best to continue ignoring him, but I saved screenshots just in case. A few days later, while at work, I looked up from my computer to see Tim enter into the far side of the studio, and my blood turned to ice. He was talking to my creative director. It looked cordial enough, and I saw Tim begin to casually scan the studio. I ducked down and bolted into my favorite project manager's office, slammed the door and unleashed upon her what must have been a nearly unintelligible explanation of what was happening. I was shaking so hard I could barely speak, but Nancy was amazing. She understood almost immediately, and she snuck me out of the building and drove me to her car to the police station, where I showed the officers the screenshots and filed a report. My co-workers later told me that Tim was there to inquire about the open designer position. He is not a designer. He had brought with him a portfolio and an elaboratedly fabricated work history that sounded legit. At the end of his interview, he casually asked if I still worked there. He said we used to collaborate. Oh, and he had written a song for me, and it had been picked up by local radio this morning. He asked my co-workers to let me know with warmest regards. That phrase still makes my skin crawl. He then left, found my abandoned car in the parking lot, and paced behind it until the police arrived. Unfortunately, he wasn't enough of a public menace for police to bring him in that day, but the incident helped me secure a restraining order against him. My company was amazing too. I was deeply embarrassed about my literary insane ex coming to the studio, but the CEO filed trespassing complaints against him and created an action plan to keep me safe if it happened again. Not long after, I moved to a different city, and that was that. I haven't heard from him since. But I discovered the most alarming part later. His roommate at the time, Liz, went through a similar experience with him during his breakdown, and when we compared notes much later, she said that she had seen a large axe in Tim's car the same week it had all gone down. She said that she was so worried about Tim's Facebook activity that she removed the axe and hid it from him. Tim was so angry that he completely trashed their house and never came back. And if our timelines are correct, This must have been just before he came to my workplace for his interview. I was about 16, and I came home from school. I heard some weird noises coming from the walk-in closet. I went to check it out, and my dad was screwing the attic door in the ceiling closed with L brackets and wood screws, as if it were never to be opened again. When I asked him what was up, he said he kept hearing the sounds of someone walking around up there. My dad is a level-headed guy. I've never seen him show any type of fear about stuff like that. It freaked me out more to see him go into such lengths to prevent the attic from ever being opened. That, well, there's some dead people up there. This happened back in 2009, when I was an 18-year-old kid in culinary school, attached to a lounge of our own, located behind the cafeteria. Couples liked going there because it was always empty and partially dark. I hated it, because it had a back door leading to the parking lot that was barely lit. Barely anyone parked there, so I found it creepy. Plus, being a horror fan, I knew that it was a perfect opportunity for things to go wrong. Long story short, I come out of class one day, and this kid I don't know starts walking up to me, almost confrontational-like. I have my knife set with me, and pull out a handle readying to defend myself. He stops and hands me a paper, which read, "Meet me in the lounge." I looked at him in confusion and asked who sent the note. Was it my boyfriend, or someone else in the culinary program, or maybe a friend from high school? He shakes his head and says he doesn't know, but I should go. I question him on what this person looks like, and he refuses to give me any information. I chuckle nervously and put the note in my pocket and walk past the kid to head to class. He starts following me, asking me if I'm gonna go, and I try to ignore him, heading towards the library to get into a public place. He follows and tries to tell me I should go, that it's my destiny or some crap along those lines. I glare at him and pick up the pace, trying to head downstairs to the cafeteria in hopes of finding a classmate and losing the kid. He runs at the same pace, telling me he doesn't understand why I'm not going. I tell him, because I don't want to, now go away, and head into the cafeteria. By this point he's really creeping me out. I grab for my phone to call the police, but instead see a classmate and run towards him. The kid follows me, pointing towards where the lounge is and telling me I'm going the wrong way. I instantly panic and tell my classmate what's going on. He approached the kid and told him to leave me alone, that I have a boyfriend and I'm not interested. The kid tells me that they're waiting for me in the lounge and to not take too long. His words still give me chills. My classmate walks me to our student restaurant and asks for some others to come with us. 3 of my other colleagues come with us to the lounge, but there's no one there. I get freaked out and decide I need to go home. They walk me through the campus to the parking lot, where I call my parents to get a ride. One of the others stays with me, while the classmate who defended me goes off to report the behavior to our teachers, who use the lounge as secondary offices sometimes. He then comes back to tell me they're going to investigate and keep an eye out for suspicious activity or that kid. A few days later, I learned that a girl had been assaulted in that area, having parked there during finals and gone through the lounge. The school newspaper had reported it, but there were no details as to who did it and if they were caught. I literally felt my stomach drop, hoping the girl was okay and hoping that those people got caught. I reported my incident to the newspaper team, but they claimed she never dealt with anything like a note, and they never found the suspects. My mum is glad I listened to my gut and didn't go. To this day, I still get chills thinking about it. The girl recovered. She got jumped but had no money, so they left her, and escaped with a few minor injuries. They never caught the attackers, and I never saw the strange kid again. All I can think of is, why me? If they're going for money. I was so poor I literally lived off sesame crackers donated by my classmates because I had no money. I'm just glad that the girl is okay. and that I listened to my gut. Who knows what would have happened if I'd have gone.
When I was 13, my mum, my younger brother and I were living with my mum's parents. We had escaped my mum's seriously abusive, psychopathic husband, and while living with my grandparents wasn't ideal, we needed a safe place for my mum to physically recover. My grandmother has trailers and sheds on the property that she would rent out to people who needed a cheap place to live, but had no other options, such as undocumented workers or people with criminal records. Most of them were really nice and just kept to themselves. And then there was Steve. Steve started asking my mum out. She was straight with him and told him no. She was still dealing with her husband's threats and had no interest in dating for the next several years, but he kept asking, then begging, then arguing. He wouldn't take no for an answer and started following her around. We'd be at the bus stop and Steve would be watching us from across the street. We'd be getting dinner and he'd sit outside the diner, watching us through the window. I'd even see him following me to and from school. We stopped letting my brother walk to his school alone because Steve would follow him too. He was always around, and then he started whispering outside our bedroom window at night. Every night for hours, the three of us would sit huddled in the dark listening to Steve ranting and raving, begging, shouting, threatening, and he would call my mum his angel, his soulmate, a tease, a demon, and all kinds of other colourful words, all the while trying to peer through the blinds. He was escalating. But why didn't we call the police, you're asking? Simple. Grandma made it very clear that Steve was a paying tenant, and as such, much more valuable than her own stupid, useless daughter. If Mum cost her money, she'd throw us back onto the street, which would cost her custody of my brother, and my brother would not survive his father on his own. So consequently, we were trapped. One night during his ranting, Steve had an epiphany. Of course my mum loved him too. Of course she wanted to be with him. The only thing keeping them apart were her children. They could be together once my brother and I vanished. I could still remember how calm and sympathetic he sounded when he assured her he'd take care of everything, and that they could be together soon. She didn't have to worry about us anymore. He'd handle getting rid of us. The next morning, my mum contacted my stepdad to ask him how to defend us physically. My stepdad, knowing my mum literally couldn't defend herself against an irritated cat, convinced my mum to tell him the problem. He told her to go home and not to worry about it, and he talked to Steve. I don't know what my stepdad said to Steve. I don't know what he did. But Steve was gone before I got home from school that day. He had only taken what he could carry and disappeared. To Steve, you already made a bad situation terrifying. My brother and I aren't children anymore. So, for your sake, let's not meet.
Let me start off by saying that I am not a street-smart person, or I wasn't several years ago. I've always been pretty naive and trusting, which has landed me in some pretty crappy situations, but this one was by far the scariest. So I had recently just gone through a really horrible, bitter breakup with my boyfriend, and found myself living alone after he packed up his bags and left. I didn't really know many people in the area, so tended to turn to the internet to pass the time. Long story short, I started chatting to a guy called John, and we really hit it off, and it turned out he lived relatively nearby. And by relatively nearby, I mean a half-hour walk away. So we decided to meet up the next day and see how it went. I phoned my friend Annie, who's infinitely wiser and more cynical than I, and told her what the plan was. She insisted she come with me, as I didn't know the guy, and he could be an axe murderer, blah blah blah. So the next day, Annie and I meet with John at around lunchtime in a local pub. It was midsummer, so we sat outside in the beer garden. It was pretty busy despite it being lunchtime, and this place was right next to a busy road, so there was nothing to worry about, right? We get some food and a beer, and we're all chatting. It's going pretty well. We're all hitting it off and having a laugh. We're taking it in turns to go to the bar to get around. I don't know if this is a term outside of England, where one person buys drinks for the whole group and then the next person goes and does the same and so on. So the day is turning into the afternoon, which is turning into the evening. The pub is filling up, and we barely notice the time goes by as we're having a good time and are filled with 5 or 6 beers, and we're pretty tipsy. John goes to the bar to get his next round in, and the next thing I know, I'm waking up the next morning in my own bed. My face is hurting, and there is blood all over my sheets. I start freaking out at this point because I literally have no recollection of what the hell happened between 8 p.m. and waking up the next day. I don't know where the blood had come from, and I don't know why I'm hurting. So tentatively, I get up and take a look in the mirror. Now my face is an absolute mess. It looks like I've been in a fight and lost badly. I have a black eye, split lip, half of my face is scrapped and bruised, and I felt sick. I was gobsmacked. What the hell happened? I open my bedroom door and go to the bathroom when I see from the corner of my eye John lying naked on my sofa. Now at this point I'm just losing my mind and start yelling at him like a crazy person, demanding he tell me what the hell's going on. He eventually calms me down and explained to me that I got out of my mind wasted the night before, how I was embarrassing myself, slurring and stumbling all over the place, and eventually I fell over a picnic bench and hit my head pretty hard. Apparently I was bleeding and refused help from anyone, so he called me a cab and brought me home like the absolute knight in shining armor that he is. I don't remember any of this, not a single moment, and I had a million questions, but at the same time I was utterly speechless. I know I'd had a few drinks, but it was no more than an average person would consume at a night out in the club. I'd had many of those. Was it possible that I'd had just one too many? I guess so. What other explanation was there? I just looked at John with my mouth open, heart absolutely pounding, and eventually managed to muster, "I'm gonna be sick." So John looked after me that morning. He peppered the day with the old tale of the dumb things I'd done the night before, and how I would never have gotten back without him. I ate and got dressed, and by the afternoon I was feeling better, so he said he wanted to take me to his house to make me dinner so that we could resume our date. You know, from the point where I'd ruined it by getting blackout drunk. So I said sure. It was nice of him to still want to hang out after everything. Like I said, I'm a naive twat. I didn't really have much situational awareness at all, so we get to his house late in the afternoon. But when I say his house, he lived in a static caravan in a caravan park. I mean, it was nice enough on the inside, but I couldn't help but get a creepy vibe from it. It was tiny. The layout was open. You open the front door into the living room, and further in you have the kitchen, the dining area, then through a door into a tiny hall where you have 2 small bedrooms and a titchy bathroom. And then there's the back door to the main bedroom. Now, I'm sitting in the dining area while he's cooking, and we're just generally making chit-chat. I'm feeling pretty awkward now because I can still remember absolutely nothing of the night before, so it feels like there's already been a power shift, like he knows more about it than me. I'm aware of it, and it's really uncomfortable. I decide I would eat his food and then politely excuse myself home. I didn't know what I was thinking coming here in the first place. I'm a pretty go-with-the-flow type of person, but even I had started thinking, what the hell am I even doing here? Just then, he asks how I'm feeling, and as I'm deep in thought, without even thinking about it, I say, I feel like I've been drugged, distractedly. At this point he flips out. He goes insane, saying that I'm accusing him. How dare I accuse him of things, and I can't prove it, and that I'm just trying to cause all sorts of problems for him. And he's on parole, so I'm basically sending him back to jail with my lies. I had no idea that he was on parole. He would later tell me, in his insane rambling texting sessions, that he was arrested for domestic assault. Great. He starts literally getting stuff out of his kitchen, and just smashes them, throwing plates against the wall, pulling the toaster out the socket, and smash that on the floor, and just having a meltdown while I'm sitting there in the tiny caravan dining table, 5 feet away, contemplating what the hell is even going on. I move to stand up, and tell him I think I'd better go.
when he suddenly lunges at me and shoves me as hard as he can. I'm on my knees, and he's laying blows into me and telling me I'm not going anywhere. He's between me and the front door at this point, and I can't see an escape route, so I turn heel and run through the corridor with him chasing me inches behind me. I dive into the nearest door and slam it shut. I'm in the tiny spare room, and there's no window that opens. I'm trapped. He's outside pounding at the door and calling me every vile curse word in his vocabulary. I yell at him to go away and he stops banging. I hear him leave for a few moments and then all of a sudden, loud thumps. He was trying to break down the door. I'm absolutely terrified at this point. I'm pushing with all my weight back against the door as if my life depended on it, which I guess it really did. The thumping carried on for what seemed like forever. Then I guess he got tired, as I heard him go to the living room and start shuffling around. I still stayed backed against the door, sobbing for at least another hour. Eventually I hear the TV come on. He's actually sitting chilling watching some TV like nothing happened, while he basically had me hostage cowering in his spare bedroom. I felt a flick of anger and adrenaline at this point. I ever so slowly and quietly open the door to peer out. The hall is in darkness, and the door to the living room is shut. I'm alone, but I'd have to walk past him to get to the front door. I'm desperately thinking of a way I can get out when I remember the back door. I creep over to it as silently as I could, and prayed that it was unlocked. It was. I silently thanked every single god I could think of and crept out, shutting the door silently behind me. I crept down the steps and then just ran. Sobbing and delirious, I was so confused. I had no idea where I was. It was pitch dark, and I'd never been in this part of town before. I ran to the nearest payphone and used the change in my pocket to call my friend to pick me up. My bag and purse were still in John's caravan, along with some other personal possessions I just abandoned. My friend drove me home, and I sobbed the whole way. I never told them what happened, and they never asked. I just got home and went to bed and cried myself to sleep. The next morning I awoke to find my phone that I'd left at home. It had about 50 text messages on it, mostly from John, telling me he's going to petrol bomb my house and kill my family, and that if he ever saw me in the street he would stab me to death, and he'd happily go to jail if it meant I were dead. I deleted them all. I was scared out of my mind. I just wanted it all to be over and to forget about him. I never really told anyone what happened, not to the full extent anyway. As the days went by, I would get crazy rambling texts from him, one moment threatening to kill me, and the next telling me he loved me and he's sorry. I deleted every message as soon as I received it. They gradually grew less frequent, and I changed my number, and not long after didn't hear from him again. I got in contact with Annie a while later. Turns out she has no memory from about 8 p.m. that night, and her boyfriend had an incoherent voice message from her, babbling and screaming and crying. He picked her up, wandering bewildered by a nearby housing estate. I know we should have gone to the police. I know I should have told someone. I know there's a million things I could have done, but I just wanted it to be over. It was the surrealest thing that had ever happened to me. Then I still sometimes think back and wonder if it really did happen because it was just so insane. A few years ago, I was on a dating site where I matched with a police officer. I thought his dog was cute and figured this was my opportunity to finally pet a canine police dog. I was quickly disinterested after listening to him complain about his recent divorce. I don't recall details, but I remember it was very apparent he was the problematic person in that relationship. I was also really grossed out by how he fetished me for my big sloppers, tattoos, and colourful hair. I was very upfront and told him I wasn't interested and that he was giving off some red flags for me. He begged me to give him a second chance, and I said no and blocked his number. A few days later, I get a knock on my door at around midnight. My heart dropped into my butt. It startled me so much. I look up my peephole and see a stranger holding food. It's an Uber Eats delivery driver. I tell him through the door that I didn't order food, but he said someone else had ordered it and he knew my name. I asked who ordered it, and he said a name I didn't recognize. I tell him I didn't want the food and gave him directions to the dumpster to throw the food out, because at this point I have no idea if he is actually from Uber. Later on, I'm going through my dating app matches and realize it was the cop's name. I go through my blocked messages, and this guy had texted me a lot. The last text was, "I hope you like your dinner." I decided it was best to unblock this man so that I could keep an eye on what was going on, in case I needed to be worried about my safety, or if I'm gonna need to buy some bear mace or drop a cop. A few weeks later, while I'm at work, as I'm a hairstylist, I get a call from a number I didn't recognize. I answer, as I assume it's a new client. A voice on the other line says, "Hey Rachel, I'm at Starbucks across the street. What's your drink order?" Who is this? I don't have you in my appointment book. Assuming it's a regular and I made a scheduling error. He says his name, and again, my heart drops to my butt. How does he know where I work? I ask him how does he know where I live and work, and he explains that he did a reverse image search on my photos from my dating app profile, found my social media and my Yelp page from my salon. Then, he looked up my address from there. I tell him I'm calling his station and reporting him for stalking, and if he ever comes near me again, I will consider it a threat and will be ready to physically defend myself. After all of that, he begs me to give him a chance. I hang up, call the police station he works at, as this is a very small town, and complain. They won't even let me email screenshots of my creepy texts. I could tell nothing would be done. The lady literally said, "Oh, I'm so sorry. He's going through a lot right now, bae." Literally treat him like he's the victim. He mostly left me alone after that, but I was so scared of living alone for the first time in my life. I have a semi-popular meme page on Instagram with about 8,000 followers. I sifted through and found like 5 of his accounts and blocked them all and moved on. This was several years ago, but all the memories came flooding back when I noticed a familiar profile photo on an account who commented on a post. I must have missed an account of his when blocking. I had posted a photo of me holding 2 big tunas I caught on a fishing trip, and he commented, "God, I wish I was one of those fish. I'd love to know what it was like to be held by you." Barf. When I was in high school, I wasn't a very hard-working student. I wasn't a troublemaker, but I was an incredibly lazy girl, working just the minimum so that my parents wouldn't get angry. I've always had some kind of easiness regarding schoolwork. I never knew what it truly meant to make an effort, so I spent all my classes drawing or copying books without many consequences. My junior year of maths, my teacher, who was seen as everyone as uptight but very caring, was pretty upset about this, as were many of my previous teachers. He wanted me to work harder. I wasn't bad at maths. I was around a grade B, but sometimes my grades would dip. During my parent-teacher meetings, he told my mum that I was wasting my capacities and that it was infuriating how lazy I was. My mum then replied that she agreed with him and that she wouldn't blame him for pushing me harder and for pushing me if it meant making me work harder. And from that day on, he did exactly what she said. In every maths class, I would always be the first person to be questioned. He would also make sure that during the tests, he'd push me and say, "You can do it, Elisa." It made me feel quite uncomfortable, because at that age no one wants to be the center of anyone's attention. My classmates started to realize that my maths teacher was a little too obsessed with me, and teasing me a lot about this. The last class before Christmas break, the maths teacher threw a little surprise Christmas party. It was very nice, him giving us chocolates and mock champagne. We had a lot of fun. And during the party he poured me another glass of mock champagne, telling me that I deserved it because I was doing better. And it was true. Because of all the attention I was forced to work harder, so my grades were being pushed to about an A. I accepted, but didn't drink it entirely, as I have diabetes and had already had way too much chocolate. But during the next class I was feeling quite ill, almost faint, and finished my last day of school before Christmas in the nurse's office. At that time I wouldn't even think it was because of the alcohol-free champagne. I thought it was due to my diabetes, that I indeed did have too much chocolate, even if it didn't look like my usual crisis. A few weeks later, my class threw some kind of charity event. It was a class project and we were very proud. In my country, we don't have proms, so it was our occasion to wear formal clothes and dance together at school. The maths teacher was invited and was helping some of the boys to tend the bar. He served me an alcohol-free cocktail, but before I could drink it, a classmate of mine called Flora poured some vodka into it, even though it was forbidden to bring alcohol to school. I was mad. Because of my diabetes, I couldn't drink alcohol, so I told her that she could just throw the cocktail away. At the time, I thought she did, but when I think about it, I wonder if she chose to not waste the alcohol and opted to drink it herself instead. The event ended pretty badly because of the alcohol Flora had bought. Some guys were very drunk and they started breaking things, and Flora passed out because of the alcohol she had. The event ended. Flora had been admitted to hospital and was in a coma. It was pretty severe, and we spent the next day at school being lectured. Flora actually got expelled from school and never went again. I was very upset with her. Because of her, every event would now be forbidden, and our projects were a failure. We gave a very bad image to the association that we were raising funds for, so I kind of ghosted her and never asked her if she was doing any better. I feel bad about it now, but at the time I was immature. But because of that, I'll never know if she was ill because of the alcohol or because of my cocktail. A few weeks later, I failed a maths test. It had been a long time since I'd failed a maths test and my maths teacher was angry. He yelled at me in front of everyone saying how much of a disappointment I was and that I was hopeless, that I would just end up living in a cardboard box under a bridge. Something was off, I was feeling it. He had a very weird look in his eye. It chilled me, and I couldn't help it, and I started crying. He calmed down a bit and said he would give me an hour of detention during which I would copy my lesson. I was a bit surprised because normally detention is for bad behavior, not for bad grades, but I was a little relieved because it was a small punishment. My parents would never know. I lived quite far from high school, and there were buses only every hour. And because of that, even if I finished a class at 4, I could never be home before 5. And when I'd gotten detention between 4 or 5, my parents would never know. But then when he officially gave me the detention hour, he said that he wanted to be personally present during it, and that the only possible hour was 5 p.m. to 6 p.m. I was nervous as I knew that meant I'd have to tell my parents, and they'd know everything. As I said earlier, I wasn't a troublemaker, so I first planned to go to detention, but during the day my friend and I spoke about it, and I was feeling more rebellious. So I decided not to tell my parents that I was in detention and that one of my friends would pick me up at 6 and drive me home. At 5 p.m. when heading towards the detention room, I was angry, mumbling that it wasn't fair to be in detention because of one bad grade. And when I arrived, I realized I was the only one waiting. I then realized that I would be the only student there, alone with that maths teacher who was a little obsessive, and it was getting dark. It was late winter, and it was a big note for me. And when I saw him coming, I panicked and said, "Sorry, I have an emergency, I have to go now. I'll email the school for rescheduling the detention," and ran off. He started to yell at him and said that I had to obey him and go to detention and that he would call my parents. But I didn't care. I knew something was up. I sprinted towards the bus stop and caught my bus and made it home. I was afraid that he'd ring my parents, so when I arrived I was shaken, but my parents greeted me normally, so I assumed that he never did. He never came back the next day, nor in the next few weeks. Eventually I learnt that he actually quit his position at the school. A shrink came during an hour to ask us if we ever wanted to talk about the maths teacher, but as no one knew what was going on, we didn't have much to say, so the shrink left and we never heard from him again, until a few months ago. I became a teacher. How ironic, given my laziness when I was a teen. And one day, chatting with my coworker, I mentioned his name, talking about my weird, bizarre maths teacher and how I skipped a detention hour, and one of my oldest coworkers went very pale hearing his name. In fact, a few days after the detention hour incident, my maths teacher was arrested for having downloaded some videos from the dark web and some kind of snuff movies starring children and young teens. maybe this detention hour was just a detention hour and I would have gotten out of it without any issues. But now I'll never know, and I've always wondered what would have happened if I'd have stayed there with him and hadn't have caught my bus. And sorry, Flora, maybe I was the reason that you were expelled.
When I just finished college, I was living in a one-bedroom townhouse/split, and I met a guy on Plenty of Fish at the time, and I wasn't exactly smart about my online digital footprint. Not like I've really changed, but at least I'm not as ridiculous as before. Anyway, he seemed like a decent guy, was really good looking, had a great job, nice teeth, and looked like he cared about his personal health. All things I would typically look for in a guy. I'm not a shallow human, but I like to be presentable, and if I'm with someone, I would like for them to care about being presentable in a business environment also. About a week of chatting online, we agreed to meet. We met at a restaurant downtown, which was really far from where I lived. When I got there, I noticed him standing at the door. We sat down to eat, and the evening went great. At the end of the date, we said bye, and I got into my car and began to drive away. I realized right away that he was following me, because of the distance to my house. I wasn't immediately scared because it's a big city. Maybe he'll turn off the freeway. But he didn't. My exit was coming up, so I decided not to take it. I kept driving. I circled the entire city on the freeway and he stayed right behind me. I was starting to panic a bit, so decided to go to my friend's house instead of mine, and when I pulled out the exit, I noticed he didn't. So I had a little bit of a moment to catch my breath and said, "Okay, screw it, I'll just go home." I took the off-ramp back onto the freeway and began going back to my exit. I got home, showered, and was getting ready to go to bed. And I started to feel dumb because, was that really him or was I overreacting? Do I ask him if he was following me? Just a number of things were racing through my overactive imagination, and I decided I was going to message him and say, "Had a good time, good night." And when I started typing, all of a sudden a message came through my phone of a picture of my car outside my house. I nearly died. My heart jumped out of my chest, and I started shaking. I didn't know what to say next, and he texts me and says, "I didn't know you lived across the street from me." I've met my neighbors, and not once have I ever met him. There's a huge apartment complex kiddie corner to my townhouse, so maybe that's where he lived. I don't know. I popped up and went to look outside, and he's there just standing there, as if he's waiting for me. I opened the door, and he asked me if he could come in, and if I wanted to still hang out. I told him I was exhausted, and I'd rather just crash out as it had been a long day. The next morning I woke up to go to work, and my windshield had been smashed. My car had been keyed, and my 2 back tires were slashed. And as I was noticing the damage to my vehicle, the guy comes out of his car with 2 coffees and was like, "Oh, I thought I'd surprise you with a morning coffee." So again I'm freaking out, called the cops and reported the damage to my vehicle. This guy offered to drive me, and something in my gut was like, "Don't get in the car." So I called my boss and told them the situation and explained I wasn't going to be there until after the police came. This guy just hung out the whole time. When the police finally got there, the guy was acting really sus. He walked away and was acting like he was hiding on the other side of his car. I filed the report. The police basically said, "I hope you have insurance," and were on their way to leave. They pulled around the corner, and all I heard was the siren on the cop car turn on, and the cops scream, "Freeze, put your hands in the air and get down on your knees." I look at the cops. One of them has his gun drawn at the guy, and the dude's on the ground getting arrested. I spoke to the cop after he got into the back, and he explained he was wanted for stalking, breach of probation, assault with a deadly weapon, fraud, and aggravated sexual assault. I was shook. It took me a few days to get over the hypothetical situation that could have happened. About a week later, I was on my way out the door to work, and guess who was sitting in my driveway?
We live in Canada, so essentially you're released on conditions until you go to jail. I told him I was late for work, but that I'd call him when I was done. I never went to work that day. I went and found a new apartment in another area of the city. I changed my phone number, and I hired my friend's husband and his friends to go back to my apartment and move it to their place for a month, and then move it to my new place, because I was so scared this dude would follow them while moving. So that's my horror story of the first time I used plenty of fish. I was born in Fitzroy, Melbourne, Australia, 1992. My brother was born in the same place in 1997. In 2001, before the Twin Towers in New York fell, my family moved to the US. A few months later, the Twin Towers did fall. No more house. So we moved to Texas for almost 7 years. We were not in a position to buy a house, so we had to rent. One night, in one of the rental homes, my brother wakes up, visibly horrified. I could tell instantly that there was something very wrong. He looks at me straight in the eyes and goes, There are red eyes in the corner of my room. I reply, No, there's not. You're having a nightmare. Leave me alone. I don't remember him leaving, but the morning came and he was no longer in my room. That's when I began to notice that he would not travel past certain parts of the rental house, but I just ignored him. For years he never mentioned the red eyes in the corner of his room again. We moved around a lot after that, and finally were able to buy our own home in Longford Drive. It was an older home for the area, early 1980s. The surrounding homes were 2000s range and actually had vinyl flooring instead of old scratched-up flooring that was light, ugly brown that looked like something out of the 70s. I used to study every scratch and scrap off the floor and would wonder what happened there. Movers, children, dogs, or something else. Regardless of the home's obvious bland and aged interior, it was at least our home. It was an early cookie-cutter house, though, you could tell. Every main room was on the first floor, and the second floor was a dominated media room with slanted ceilings for the roof and a huge walk-in attic. The attic was practically its own room, which I suppose my parents liked at the time, due to their endless 80s furniture from Australia that for some reason they refused to part with. The most disgusting of all of this furniture was a couch with fishes on it. A navy and yellow couch with very detailed fish on it that were a variety of colors. I don't recall when they finally got rid of it, but I am glad that they did. I'm glad they got rid of a lot of things when we left that house. It took a few years, 5 to be exact, to truly realize something wasn't right, and it all started the night before sophomore year of high school. My best friend Chelsea and I had practically grown up in that town. We had heard all the legends, laughed about them with our friends and boyfriends, but I guess that night we got brave. So we went to the local graveyard that was at least 200 years old and decided to wander around it and take pictures on an old digital camera, new camera at that point. My friend Chelsea had claimed in the past that she could see spirits. To this day, I'm still not sure if she believed in that, even after what happened. I'm laughing about something, stumbling through the graveyard like a disrespectful teenager. We've all been there, right? Remember when you knew about death but still didn't process that it would happen to you? Sometimes I like that still. Does it go with age? Chelsea stops laughing. I look back at her because the silence stuns me. She's white. She's a white Jewish girl, but she was unnaturally white at this moment. Her brown eyes looked black, and they are big. We need to leave. What? She speaks angrily. We need to leave now. I feel something almost consume me, just about dread and fear, but beyond all that, there's no fight or flight. It's just like it's broken, and we stare at each other like we're not going to let whatever is about to happen happen. Like we won't get home tonight and just have to accept it. It's at that moment that Chelsea breaks. I watch her throwing up her feet as she gets further and further away from me, and more towards the little red Mustang on the horizon. I don't know how. I don't remember, to be honest, but I ended up following her somehow and suddenly was grabbing the handle of my Mustang. Then I was inside, and the feeling that I had faded. What did you see? Nothing. But I felt, let's go, I don't want to talk about it. Where's the camera? I handed her the camera, and she flipped through the pictures I had taken. They were unusually blurry, and she scrolled. I saw more and more bubble-looking things. Dust. That's what I initially thought. I knew nothing back then, I suppose. She stared intensely at some very specific ones, then a look of rage came onto her face. She began deleting every picture furiously, and in that moment I thought one and only thing: drama queen. I dropped Chelsea at her house. She said very little. I told her I would see her at school tomorrow, and she turned and said, "Make sure you remove the SD card from the camera before you go home. Make sure all the photos are deleted." I ignored her, rolled my eyes, and after she had shut the door and turned away, I went home, laid out my first day of school clothes, and slept better than I had in a long time. I think I slept better back then, honestly. Now I'm a serious insomniac. My brother's room was right next to mine at Longford Drive. We slept with our doors open. I'm not sure why. I think it was a childhood habit that I never would participate in today. I woke up at 6:15 that morning, to his pancaked face wailing over me. To this day, I've never seen him so frightened in his life. He was screaming and wailing at me that someone had come into my room. "What?" I say. "Someone's in your room, get up!" He dragged me out of bed and ran to the door, still clinging to me. I was more awake now and threw on the light, and I saw nothing except my tacky lilac room. He ran to the closet and flung the door open. Nothing. But in my gross mid-2000s clothes, he ran to the bathroom, threw the door open, threw the shower curtain back. Nothing. I looked at him, eyebrows raised, and almost laughing at him. His face then turned paler. I woke up, and there was a light in the hallway, and I saw a man. He was older and had a long beard, overalls, and he was just floating. He walked into your room. I saw it. It's not a dream. Don't look at me like that. I saw him. He began tearing up from frustration. And my parents had noticed the sound at this point and came in. He told them what had happened. The first exchange between the adults. He's on ADD medication. He's just been having nightmares. We should probably switch him? Yes. But would you, if you saw Jesus? My mother had noticed his face before stating this. It was a face of disbelief, frustration, anger, and horror, and I'm sorry to my brother that I didn't believe you either. My mind had already begun to favor the adult side of things, too scared to lend the possibility of there being things that we don't understand, too arrogant and egotistical, and for that I'm sorry. He moved out of that room soon after that, and into the guest bedroom, and the guest bedroom furniture moved into his old room. I was now alone on that side of the house, which I enjoyed for a time. I rearranged my bedroom furniture, as I wanted to participate in a change as well. One night not long after, I woke from the sound of footsteps in the hall. It was a small hall that only led me to the now guest bedroom and my room. I figured it was my dad checking on me. My older brother had passed away when I was a baby, and my father never truly recovered from it. He would often come to check on us while we slept. He always just wanted to make sure we were still breathing, I guess. We were 3 of the 4 children left. My older sister was married and lived far away, so we were always the babies that were left. The footsteps persisted. It was so familiar that I rolled over and got more comfortable, preparing to fall back asleep, and checked out my back door to look into the hallway, but there was nothing. Only the dim nightlight was staring back at me. Okay, he's walking around the kitchen for his late-night glass of milk, I guess, and I leaned to the right to peer past the hallway. The kitchen lights were off, but the steps persisted.
I was half awake and confused. I closed my eyes and listened hard. Where the hell was that coming from? My eyes burst open as I realized. I slowly followed my lilac wall to the ceiling, which was unpainted. I froze and stared in disbelief. It was coming from the attic. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I felt something was so wrong that I had to stay awake in case it decided it wanted to consume me. Something was there with me. A week later, my parents complained about squirrels in the attic, and I was suddenly sleeping very well again. But then I heard it again, even after the exterminator said the holes were patched and that the squirrels were gone. No sleep was had. The next day I went to the attic to figure this out for myself. I opened the attic door and walked up the stairs and studied where my room would be under this attic and found it. I walked over as far as I could go and suddenly saw nothing but insulation that was covering the entirety of where my room would be. That night was the first time I ever slept with my door closed, and it has not changed since. But the footsteps continued. Sometimes the footsteps sounded rushed, sometimes angry, sometimes sad. But they wouldn't come every night. Chelsea stopped sleeping over. I complained to my parents about the squirrel noises every now and then, but the exterminator never found anything. No traces of anything, rats, bugs, squirrels, nothing. My parents didn't believe me, and my brother would almost ignore me when I mentioned it. He didn't want to hear it. Months went by, and finally I was able to convince Chelsea to come over for a minute and watch some TV. As she entered the house, we were gossiping about someone from school. We laughed in the hallway, and then it happened again. She stopped, and this time she fixed her eyes on the stairs leading to the media room. The stairs were a zigzag stairs, so the stairs would go up, then it would be flat, and then the stairs would go in the opposite direction, and then there would be the media room. On the wall after the first set of stairs was a painting my mother had painted of a thunderstorm. Chelsea parted her lips and said in a whisper, "There's someone standing at the top of your stairs. I can see them in the painting's reflection." She then left. I told my father that I suspected someone was in the media room. He searched everywhere up there but found nothing. I told him Chelsea must have just been seeing shadows then. After a few months, I stopped going up to the media room. I used to secretly watch Family Guy up there when my parents were at work, but something was just wrong. I felt wrong being up there. Halloween came around, and my brother and I were instructed to pull everything out of the attic. My brother ditched me halfway through as I was pissed. I angrily started grabbing the boxes and was verbally venting to myself about his lazy nature. I stared down the steps of the attic and slowly started to lose my grip on one of the boxes. I paused to adjust it, still livid. Then I heard something. Psst. A shot of air was blown from behind my head, right next to my ear. I watched a few strands of air react to the shot of air and flew out in front of my face on the left side, like someone had intentionally snuck up behind me and blown air at the back of my ear in an attempt to scare me. Except I was the only person here. I was venting about it after all. I knew where my brother was. He was downstairs playing Call of Duty with his stupid friends. Dad was in his room watching Judge Judy, his favorite, and my mum was on a 3-day trip. She was a flight attendant. She was in Seattle, 6 states away. I watched my hair fall back to the side of my face, and I dropped the boxes and let out a scream. I don't think I have yet to top it. 12 years later, and I have never screamed like that again. I jumped and leapt down the remainder of the stairs and fell out of the attic door to the media room. My brother was already halfway up thinking something horrible had happened, and I trembled out what happened. Someone blew in my ear. My hair, I saw it fly past my head. A smile crackled on his face and he started laughing at me. Payback. For when I laughed at him for the first time, I suppose. Except this time, he was the one in denial and disbelief. He was like me, he didn't want to believe it. Life was already too scary and overwhelming. Why believe that on top of it? My dad followed,
and I immediately started lying to his horrified face. I tripped. Oh, are you okay? Yeah. Okay, finish getting the Halloween stuff out. Yes, sir. I turned to my brother and threatened to hurt him if he didn't finish helping me. He didn't. I waited for my mother to get home to explain. I wanted to do it with her, and I would help her set up the Halloween stuff. She was delighted. Over the next few years, as a result, I developed a habit of sleep aids. Nothing major, just over-the-counter stuff. To this day, I take about 3 sleeping pills to aid at night. My husband doesn't understand how my body has built up that kind of tolerance, and he doesn't believe it either. If only he knew. The footsteps never stopped, till the day we moved out. They never stopped. I finally started doing research into the house. Turns out it was owned by an older couple before us, and the husband chose to end his own life via noose in the attic. Above my room. Financial problems, apparently. I told my parents, but they didn't believe me, and I never told my brother. I figured he wouldn't want to know. I still wonder if he has nightmares, or if they stopped. Mine didn't. But they have just gotten more complex with age. Taxes, career, break-ins, car wrecks, plane crashes, ghosts of the past, you name it. We moved about a year later. I came home from university one day in our new home. My mother's dream home. She asked me to go back to Longford Drive. Our old mail was apparently over there, so I drove up to the house and a shiver went down my spine. I stared at my left ear. I had lived in a normal home for a few months now, and hadn't realized how wrong Longford had felt. Something was really wrong, wasn't it? Did I let it in? With the picture from the night at the cemetery? Or had it always been there, and just hadn't noticed until my brother had his episode that morning? I don't know. I don't want to know. Sometimes things are so frightening or traumatizing that you feel like you don't need to know. You don't want to face it again. The world is scary enough. I walked to the front door one last time, rang the doorbell, and an older woman answered the door. I smiled and told her I was there for the mail. She jumped and went, "Oh, yes, here," and handed me a bundle of letters, magazines, and what was mostly junk mail. As an adult, I confirm it was mostly junk mail. I said thank you and began to turn around, but she stopped me. "Did you live in this house?" "Yes, ma'am, for many years." Can I ask you something?" "For sure." "Did you have problems with critters getting into the attic? We had someone come and check, but they said there was no sign of anything up there. It almost sounds like footsteps at night. My granddaughter comes and stays and keeps complaining that it sounds like footsteps. Does it sound familiar to you?" "No, sorry." She wouldn't have believed me anyway. But this time, I just need someone to believe me. This story happened quite a few years ago when I was much younger and more naive. I want to preface this story by stating that I have learned my lesson. I am now in a happy and long-term relationship that has taught me a lot about my self-worth. I started my second year of university. I'm an overweight female and was very focused on my studies while in high school, so even though I had a large group of friends and went to parties, I was always putting school first. I didn't date because I saw it as a distraction, and to be completely honest with myself, no one was really interested in me. Most of my male friends were gay, and the straight ones were already dating all my other friends. It wasn't until university that I decided maybe it was time for me to open myself up to the concept that I should start dating and share my time with someone. So about a week before school started, I was heading to our local mall to hang out with some friends and buy some new clothes for the year. I just needed enough nice things for the first week, and then I couldn't care what I looked like. At this time I had a license, but did not possess a car, so the only means of transportation available to me were walking, friends that took pity on me, and the bus. Unfortunately, today I was at the mercy of public transportation. I was already on my connecting bus heading to the mall when I watched a young guy walk onto the bus. He looked to be a few years older than me and was in quite good shape. As this was the bus heading to the mall, the route was quite busy, and my seat was the last seat open. He proceeds to sit next to me. I don't pay him much attention, as I was texting my friend. When I was finished texting, I did everything I could to not engage with the guy beside me. My phone was an older phone that had a slide-out keyboard but no internet access or games. Like I said, this happened a while ago, and I was able to avoid his stare for about 10 minutes until he shifted his weight and I made accidental eye contact with him. It was at this point that he smiled at me and said that I looked quite beautiful. He commented on how pale my skin was and how pretty it looked contrasting against my dress. I smiled uncomfortably but began talking to him. It was nice to be acknowledged, but I was still wary. I gave him a fake name and continued conversing when the bus stopped at the mall. He asked me what my phone number was, and I told him I didn't know him that well and that I'd see him around. I spent the whole day with my friends, and then it was time to head home. My mother had already arranged to pick me up at the plaza closer to our house, but I still needed to take the bus to this location. As I'm settling down for the ride back, I see this guy coming on the bus. I hate to admit it, but I was a bit happy to see him on the bus, and when he sat down beside me, I was flattered. We spoke the whole ride home, and when he stopped, he came up and asked me for my phone number. This time, I gave him my Facebook instead. He actually laughed when he realized I provided him with a fake name and credited me with being smart about it. I'm a naturally cautious person, and my Facebook didn't contain many personal details or even many pictures, as I used it mostly to connect with friends or group assignments or private chat, so I didn't feel very nervous about providing him with that info. That night he began messaging me, and for a few weeks we only messaged on Facebook. After a few weeks of chatting, I felt comfortable enough to give him my cell phone number, and we arranged a face-to-face meetup. To my excitement, the meetup goes well. We met in a public coffee shop, pay our own ways, and at the end of the date we go our separate ways, and I actually looked forward to seeing him again. We make plans to go on another date, but in about a week. Life is a bit crazy around September, and I felt bad putting off more time together, but he seemed to understand and gave me space. The next date he planned on his own, and gave me some time to deal with his personal life, and I thought that it was sweet of him. He wanted to pick me up, but I agreed to meet him at the movie theater instead. We still hadn't known each other that long, and I didn't want him knowing where I lived. I'm so thankful that I made this choice. Also, the theater was in a plaza not too far from my house. We went to see Paranormal Activity 2 in the theater. I love scary movies so much, and I find them more funny than scary. The entire movie I was laughing and having a grand old time, but when I would look at him he wouldn't look so pleased. This put me on edge, but I try not to worry and chalk it up to him not wanting to look scared in front of me when I'm clearly not afraid. When the movie ends, he proceeds to explain his plan and why he was looking so sour. He was hoping I would get so scared that I would jump into his arms for protection, and he would be able to use that as a segue to more intimate activities. The dinner plans we were supposed to have afterwards weren't real, and he was hoping to take me home with him. I'm not okay with this plan, so I faked that my mum called me and that I had to go home immediately. He asks for a ride as he actually walked over to the theater, and I agree and get in my car and drive him to his house. I figure that he didn't have a car at his disposal and was originally going to pick me up in a friend's vehicle. Also, he lived a 2-minute walk from the theater. I drop him off at his house and he goes in for a kiss. I try to turn my face, but he holds it in place. When we finished kissing, he's talking about how much he loves me and is looking forward to spending all his time with me. I am floored and disgusted at the situation, so I laugh nervously and say goodbye. Before I reverse out of his driveway, he tries to open my driver's side door, but thankfully it's locked. My window is slightly rolled down and he tries to push it down with his fingers, and when I don't relent, he proceeds to kiss my window and lets me leave. I'm officially creeped out. I want to leave as quickly as I can. For the next few days after the date, I felt very uncomfortable with the whole situation,
and his texts were getting progressively creepier. They would range from "I love you" to "I can't wait to marry you," "Our babies are going to be the most beautiful in the world," and it had only been around a month at this point and he was already talking about babies and marriage. I showed a friend the texts and explained the situation, and she gave me a huge hug and told me her own story, and suggested that if I were really done with him I should just break up with him, and just because he made the first move, I wasn't a prude or a tease for ending it. I didn't know him anything, and I felt so much lighter after talking to her that I messaged him right away and broke things off. I went to class thinking it was going to be just that easy, but it wasn't. He proceeded to flood my phone with messages. At first, they were concerned. He wondered where we went wrong and what he did to scare me off. When I didn't respond instantaneously, he changed tactics and began saying he was going to kill himself and that I was his soulmate. At this point, I was out of class and able to address the multitude of messages. I called him and explained that I didn't feel a connection, that it was better for me to end it early, and that I didn't want to lead him on. I also told him that it was not worth killing yourself over, and if he was feeling that way, he needed to speak to someone about it. This started a new barrage of texts and voicemails, calling me various terrible names and blaming me for leading him on. He said that it was my fault he was going to end his life, and that I was a horrible person, and called my phone constantly, causing me to flat out turn it off. This is the point at which I told my mum. She didn't judge me for not telling her earlier, as she was supportive that I tried to handle it on my own, but was angry that he was acting so erratically. She was a bit nervous at his escalation, especially as she worked in criminal law and sees the worst in humanity on a daily basis. I followed her advice and texted him that I'm not responsible for his choices or behavior, and that I stand by my decision to break up with him, and that I do not condone the way he speaks to me, and that I would not respond anymore, and that if he persists I would be forced to contact the police. The last part only made things worse, and he continued to send me messages about self-harm. When I stopped responding, he started threatening me and my family. He threatened that he would find and kill me and then hang himself. I immediately removed him from Facebook and warned all my friends not to give up my personal information to anyone. I was comforted knowing he had no idea where I lived, but I frequented that plaza often with my family. I was scared he would see me one day and follow me home. The scary thing was I lived only 5 minutes away from him, so it was feasible that he could randomly spot me anywhere in our neighborhood. I became a recluse, and the messages continued. They were getting more and more aggressive. At first he was threatening to kill me, but then he began attacking my family. When he threatened to kill my sister, I lost it. I had had enough and was ready to stand up for myself, so I called him and waited. He picked up the phone, trying to act all sweet. I didn't give him any chance to try and smooth things over with me. I told him that threatening me was one thing, but coming after my family was another, and I told him he was a horrible person and absolute filth. I did say a few things I'm not proud of, but in the moment they made sense to say. I told him it was over, and that I was done. One more attempt at contact and I was going straight to the cops, and reminded him I knew where he lived and that it would be easy to find him. I like to think the last part scared him because he hung up and never contacted me again. For the next little while I was very cautious about leaving my home, and my family avoided the plaza at all costs. I saved all the threatening text messages just in case, and kept my old phone even when I upgraded to a new one. About 1.5 years later, my friend decided to look him up on Facebook against my wishes, and discovered that he had moved and I didn't need to worry about a chance meeting. She also discovered that his new fiancée could have passed as my twin. It was unsettling to know that she was almost identical to me, and had started dating her not long after I told him to finally leave me alone. To the guy that professed his love to me and then threatened to kill himself and me, please, let's never meet again.
My good friend Andrew had been talking to a girl, Lily, from the UK for almost a year online. She was cute, sweet, and had all kinds of friends and a loving family. Lily had hundreds of photos and anecdotes, and a seemingly real life.
Her friends and family would all post comments on her MySpace page, telling her how they had an awesome weekend, that they wanted to hang out with her soon, and that they were sorry they missed their call and happy birthday, etc. Eventually, Andrew started to have deep feelings for Lily. He told his parents about her, then his close friends. Andrew bought endless amounts of calling cards and would phone her whenever convenient for both. At around 9 months into it, Lily expressed an interest in moving to the US so that she could be closer to him. There had been talks about moving in together. Lily told Andrew she had spoken to her parents, and they suggested that she visit with a friend before committing to a move. Andrew was over the goddamn moon. He walked around for weeks talking about Lily, and how amazing she was, and how she was going to be visiting for a week, and how we all had to meet her. When Andrew went to pick up Lily and her friend from the airport, Lily wasn't there. The two individuals he met called themselves Jenny and Sam, sister and brother, or so they claimed. The story was that Lily became anxious and nervous about flying overseas to meet the love of her life, and swapped her ticket out for Sam at the last minute. Jenny and Sam were supposed to see if Andrew was who he claimed to be, as well as scope out the area and check out the town. When Andrew returned home, he talked online with Lily for a few hours, with her apologizing profusely. He reassured her and told her it was okay, and that he understood her nervousness. I met Jenny and Sam at the party. Andrew was towing them everywhere, trying to impress them, so that they only had good things to report back to Lily. Jenny and Sam were normal. They stuck together the whole time, drank some beers, laughed at jokes, struck up conversations. The only thing that would have seemed odd were the amount of photos they were taking. But at the same time, it was assumed that they were trying to document their trip for Lily. A couple of days before Jenny and Sam had to leave, they told Andrew the truth. Honestly, I don't know if it's the real truth, and I don't think I'll ever know. Their names weren't Jenny and Sam. They weren't related. There was no Lily. Lily was really someone named Alicia. All the photos of Lily on MySpace had been taken from her MySpace. The photos and family members were all Alicia's friends, but with different names. All the comments on Lily's profile and photos were fabricated. They were put there by these fake friends and relations. Alicia had no idea that this doppelganger profile existed. She had no idea that Andrew existed. Jenny and Sam told Andrew that there was a fake profile for him as well, and they showed it to him. His doppelganger was just named Justin or something like that. Justin had all the same family members and friends that Andrew had, but with different names. They told Andrew they'd been playing this game for a while, but it wasn't just them. They could count 20 people off the top of their head that were in this game from all over the world. They pulled out this book for Andrew to look at. This is the part that really freaked me out. It was the book of Andrew's life. Every single piece of information Andrew had shared with Lily was documented in this book. There was an excerpt from their chat log, i.e., Andrew hung out with Brian today. He's my best friend. Lily, oh yeah, that's the guy with you in your default photo, right? Any pertinent information, i.e., photos of Brian, and a brief description of who he is to Andrew, and footnotes. The footnotes were extensive and unbelievable. In this example of Brian, it would include things like 1. Dating Karen P., page 22. 2. Was in a band with Eric J., page 17, and Mike C., page 9. 3. Is Brad D.'s younger brother, page 11. The amount of linked information in this book was the biggest mind melt. It was an extensive web, the network of friends and family in the group. It included all kinds of information and pictures. Jenny and Sam had admitted to taking all the photos on their trip so that they could add it to this book and add it to the profiles online. Andrew kept the book and refused to give it back to them, and he kicked them out of his house. He was shocked and heartbroken. Later on, he logged onto his messenger client, and Lily instant messaged him. He told her that he knew she wasn't real, that it had been a giant WTF, and he wanted to know what the person pretending to be Lily had to gain.
Lily didn't respond. She stopped talking to Andrew, and Andrew never received a real answer in regards to what he endured. I saw the book before Andrew shredded and burnt it. There was a photo and a small blurb about me in there. 1. Recently moved from unknown city, California. 2. Dating Aaron B. Page 6. City police officer. 3. Good friends with Allison S. Page 26. And Reed P. Page 21. 4. Hates soda, gum, flip-flops. Loves Harry Potter, beers, cookies. My husband and I work as a team on residential houses. I do the electrical, he does the HVAC. The job was supposed to be an empty house someone had just inherited, and it was in pretty rough shape. It was already getting dark out and we had a bad vibe about the house. Someone had completely destroyed the electrical leading to the air conditioning unit and pulled the thermostat wires out of the wall, amongst other things. We kept hearing footsteps upstairs, where the attic should have been. We called out, "Hello, is anyone there?" and no one answered. We kept hearing footsteps upstairs, on what would have been the attic. We call out, "Hello, is anyone there?" and no answer, but we could still hear the footsteps. I found the attic hatch and to my surprise there was a deadbolt on it. I slid the lock, then slid and opened it and saw nothing. So I slid the lock back in place and we left, chalking it up to there probably being a squatter that lived there and bounced. I keep thinking about the lock though. Why was it there? Keeping something in or keeping something out? Either way, I'm not going to go back to find out. I'm sharing this in the hopes that it becomes a kind of cautionary tale to other insecure people who meet other people online. When I was 16, I was very insecure with myself. I had had a hard time making friends and was basically invisible to boys. I made a lot of friends online in chat rooms. Mind you, this was the early 2000s. It was during the summer that I was staying with my sister to watch her kids because she broke her foot at carnival, and my 2 nieces and nephew were a huge handful for her. So I got to stay up all night to use the computer. I was pretty lonely because I just moved from my old school following the divorce of my mum and stepdad, and couldn't really hang out with my friends for a while because of my situation. I talked to a few guys, even video chatted a few times, but it was all quite innocent. Until I met a guy from California. He wouldn't tell me his age and wouldn't even send a picture, but I got the impression that he was an adult because he told me he had his own apartment. He claimed his camera was broken, totally legit, right? He even tried to talk to me into coming out and visit him. He told me he would get me a ticket and we could meet. He told me that I would have the time of my life and that we could do things together. He seemed excited about the fact that I'd never been with anyone before. After about a week, he convinces me to lift up my shirt so that he can see me. It took a lot of convincing and he was like, "Come on, it's only me." Stupidly, I gave in. I didn't really think much about it afterwards, but I never did it again, and I continued to talk to him. But when summer was winding down, my sister didn't really need my help anymore, so I wasn't at her house or able to use her computer. One day, about 2 weeks before school started back up, my best friend Amanda called me and said, "Hey, I have a question for you. Why am I looking at a picture of your tits right now?" I was completely floored. For a while, I didn't even know what she was looking at. I didn't even know what to say. I could only ask what she meant, and she told me that a random guy just sent her an attachment, and when she opened it, it was me. The guy's screen name was the guy I had been talking to. She'd also gotten calls from some other people that we were friends with, because they had also gotten the picture. Apparently, this guy had hacked me. He got my friends list. My neighbor got the picture. I know because he approached me about it. He was really nice and understanding about the situation. He had a sister about my age and felt really protective of me. But oh my God, it was so embarrassing. And I begged him to not tell my mum, which he didn't. Amanda had to get into her parents' email profiles because he had also hacked into her list somehow and sent it to everyone on hers. Her parents both had emails with the attachment of the picture. They never got the picture and never found out.
We were able to keep it pretty quiet. The only people who knew were my peers. I eventually got online again and found about 100 messages from him. I finally messaged him back and asked him why, and he said it was because I hadn't returned his messages. He got mad at me because I stopped talking to him. I told him he had ruined my life and all he had to say was sorry, before he blocked me. He didn't contact me again, and he didn't send out my picture anymore. But as far as I know, about 20 or 30 kids I had gone to school with had gotten the picture. I was glad that I didn't go to that school anymore. But every time I visited and we went around town, I saw people I'd gone to school with, and I knew that they knew. They'd point and laugh, and I was never more glad that I didn't have a computer at home. I didn't even use my AIM profile when I visited Amanda's or my sister's house. To the adult man who tried to completely ruin my life when I was still in high school because you felt that I'd rejected you, I hope that you got caught somehow, and no one ever fell for your nonsense. I hope you went to prison, and had all these things that you wanted to do to me done to you. And I hope to God we never, ever meet. When I was 16, I made the monumentally bad decision to run away from home and live with my boyfriend at the time, Brad, who was 19, and one of my best friends who was my age called Bethany, and her boyfriend Ivan of 23. I can't even begin to enumerate all the ways in which this was a horrible idea and a bad situation. But I was a very stupid teenager, and it seemed adventurous and fun, and I was exhilarated by the lifestyle these men were living. My absolute best friend at the time, also my age, called Christy, was dating a 20-year-old named Alex that was selling psychedelic mushrooms. He always let us have some first tastes, so that he could get a general idea of how strong they were, and how much to charge for them. For some reason, I can't even begin to recall right now, Ivan and Bethany were out of town, and Christy and Alex were staying in the master bedroom for the weekend. There were several whitecaps in Alex's most recent batch, and those were the ones that we were eating. Over the course of a few hours, my boyfriend and I were growing restless with how long it was taking for the drugs to kick in, and stupidly ended up eating 7 grams between us. It didn't take long after the last dose for me to start tripping, and it was a very hard, very uncomfortable and intense trip. I remember that it took the drugs longer to hit my boyfriend, so he had to watch over me for about an hour while I had a temporary psychological breakdown. I won't go into what I experienced during the trip, because that really wasn't the point of sharing this. Against advice, I ended up forcing myself to throw up everything I could to end the trip as quickly as possible. Alex and Christy were already in bed. After I'd been sick, for the most part I was coming down, and I went to lie down with my boyfriend in the dark. And that was when he started tripping. He was thinking very cyclical and repeating the words to Tool songs as if they were Bible passages. None of this struck me as particularly odd, for some reason, even though I'd never seen cyclical thinking to this degree during a trip, and the unfamiliarity should have set off alarm bells in my head. This was when the scary part started. One minute I was doing my level best to calm him down and reassure him. The next minute, he was on top of me with my head between his hands in an attempt to snap my neck. He didn't try for very long, but I didn't try to run immediately after he'd stopped, because I was between him and a wall, and he was much, much larger than I was, and I wasn't sure I could make it. Seeing no other option, I soothed him while I tried to construct an escape. He tried to break my neck twice more before an out presented itself. I have no idea how I survived this because he was absolutely physically capable of doing it. A short time after his third attempt, he somehow decided that we needed to get married. He picked me up and started to carry me completely naked into the bedroom that Alex and Chrissy were sharing, somehow convinced them that one of them could perform legal marriage rites. This was the best opportunity I'd seen for an escape, so I did. Before we could get to the bedroom, I fought him like a wild animal, clawing and writhing and screaming like a banshee, when finally he lost his grip and I fell. Then I scrambled into the bathroom and locked the door. I vaguely remember knocking over a chair as I ran in to slow him down. As soon as I'd locked the door, I began hearing a commotion on the other side. There was yelling, scuffling, and unintelligible babbling, and then someone knocked on the door. I was absolutely terrified of losing my life, so I ignored the knocking and started trying to figure out how to open the sealed bathroom window. And after minutes of this desperate knocking, I realized it was coming from Christy. She'd been yelling the whole time to open the door and let her in. The moment I realized that it was her, I unlocked without thinking. As soon as I swung the door open, my boyfriend broke out of Alex's arms 5 feet away from the bathroom, knocked my friend out the way, and ran into me. Alex had thought he'd completely immobilized him, but he was very wrong. My boyfriend tackled me to the bathroom floor and redoubled his efforts to break my neck. I remember my head being twisted so far round I could clearly see the tiny pins in the bathroom towel behind me. I'm incredibly lucky that Alex was there, because I probably would have died if he hadn't been. He yanked my boyfriend off me for long enough for Christy to crash into the bathroom with me and lock the bathroom door behind her. I was sobbing uncontrollably, naked and bruised, and more terrified than I'd ever been in my life. But she was clear-headed enough to impress upon me the importance of getting the hell out of the house. The only clothes that I could find were a waded-up black sweater with a cat decal on the front and a pair of men's boxers, and both were crusted with dried vomit. My friend finally managed to pry the window open and we crawled out, covered in vomit, tear-streaked and bruised. I followed her to a nearby friend's house. I was utterly hysterical by the time we got there, but I managed to give my friends a basic outline of what happened, and Walter, of the pair, left the apartment exclaiming that he had to find my boyfriend, and I absolutely understand that. I even somehow managed to understand it at the time. I knew that this behavior was the drugs talking, not my boyfriend, and that his safety was important. I won't say that I thought he had as much of a claim to safety at that moment as I did, because I was running on adrenaline and determined to survive, and not at all concerned with justice or rational fairness, but he definitely didn't deserve to be forgotten just because some drugs had affected him adversely. Finally, I managed to calm down on my friend's couch and stop hyperventilating. It was at this point that Walter arrived back home, and who does he have in tow? My psychotic boyfriend wrapped in the black curtain with pupils the size of saucers. My boyfriend sat down as he settled on the couch next to me and started apologizing profusely for what he'd done. He listened for a few minutes, my body as tense and as rigid as it had ever been, when he started to slip back into cyclical thinking. I learned then through his ramblings that he tried to kill me because he thought that God had told him that he had to kill me so that we could be together in heaven. After I lost the ability to deal with the trauma and stress, disheartened by my friend's inability to see that his proximity to me was putting me in danger, I jumped up from the couch, ran out the apartment complex, as I couldn't face another murder attempt with or without my friends present. I ran all the way to another nearby friend's apartment and ended up staying there for the night, still covered in vomit and tears. I've been traumatized by the experience. We broke up within a few months and he ended up mildly stalking me for a short time and a few years later. But he's in a different state now. Admittedly, I could have handled the entire situation with a little more caution and intelligence, but I didn't. I tried not to think about how it affected my life, but I'm sure it had a very negative impact and influence that I'll never forget.
To be clear, since I was a child I have lived in a house with 3 rooms and an attic. I have 1 brother and 2 sisters. We've had to share rooms. My sisters both got their own room on the 2nd floor, and me and my brother shared the attic. Our attic has a sloping roof. When I was younger, I always saw big, round eyes under the sloping roof on the landing of the attic, similar to an owl when you see its whole eye. But I used to think it were birds, because I always saw on TV that birds had big round eyes, but now that I'm older, I think that birds could not have come under the roof. There was also nothing electronic or anything at all that would be located there. And during the day it seemed quite normal,
and every evening I saw them again. Now, I recently had a conversation with my mother and grandmother about this, and they told me that not only I, but also my brother and sister saw it. My sister only can't remember it, and my brother partially. She also said that when we were younger, she would sometimes go to look when we told her about it, but she could never see anything and didn't think anything of it. Then suddenly my grandmother told us that she always felt some kind of negative energy in the attic. So we went upstairs and I pointed out the exact spot. She then said it was the exact spot where she felt it, and that it was still there. Against my better judgment, at the beginning of the month I got Tinder, and I matched with a few guys. One of them was called James. We ended up texting each other, and he seemed pretty chill and pretty into me. He's a decent looking guy, and we seemed to click. He had apparently been in a relatively abusive relationship with a woman and was looking to start over. According to him, she had hit him with a frying pan and pepper sprayed him once. He kept going on about how crazy she was. Alright, it happens. We went to the movies this past Friday, and I had a great time. We ended up talking for a few hours, and we hit it off pretty well. I asked about the ex because I was a bit curious as to why he'd stay with someone like that. He didn't say anything positive about her, just that she was crazy, had mental illnesses and didn't take her meds. That kind of stuff. She had tried the baby trap, but had a miscarriage. He expressed relief that she didn't end up with the kid. He said he had felt obligated to her. Again, I get that. In all, I had a good time. Then, morning rolls around, and he tells me that he had hooked up with his ex last night, and that he was going to try and work things out with her. Mildly insulting that I had lost out to an abusive chick, but whatever. I tell him it's cool, and a few hours later, he texted me, saying that she was crazy. He thought she had changed, but she hadn't, and he kept asking to see me. He was being very pushy about wanting to see me today. He begged for 5 minutes of my time so that he could explain to me, and I politely told him I didn't want to be involved with anyone who was so clearly hung up on his ex. This is where it got nuts. He admitted he was still, but that he wanted to see me today so that I could meet her and she could determine if I was better for him than she was, and that she wanted him to be happy because he and I had a connection. I flipped after that and told him that the fact he needed his ex to determine who was right for him was absolutely nuts, and that is not what love is, and that I wanted no part of it. His ex started texting me after that, and it was non-stop insults and incoherent stuff that made no sense. She also dropped the bomb that she was his wife, and I told her to piss off and basically blocked the number. I went on Tinder to message him where I called him a piece of crap, and that if he was intelligent, he should leave her and never message me again. He started to harass me hard, saying that I was miserable because they have a beautiful love together and all this crazy stuff. He then went on to say, "My wife knows where you work. I hope she doesn't do anything too rash." And I told him that if that was a threat, I'd gladly go to the police. He said that she'd been to jail before and she's not afraid, and that she loves him so much she'd mess up anyone and risk the jail time for him, that she'd kill my friends if they tried to protect me, and that she's armed and dangerous. I told him goodbye, reported him and deleted my Tinder account. I did go to the police, but since it wasn't a direct threat, they couldn't do much. The cops think that James was more or less full of crap and just trying to scare me, since some people love getting off on that. He said that I did the right thing by blocking him and reporting him, and that I should just keep my eyes open and alert the people at my job. Scary thing is, James seemed perfectly normal, but he lied about being married, how he felt towards his wife, and he flipped like a switch. His excuse for not being upfront about being married was that they were going to get a divorce. He seemed so docile and unassuming that the hatred and aggressive attitude was insane. I have to honestly wonder, what would have happened if I'd have gone to talk for 5 minutes? I'm kinda concerned, since they do know where I work. But if either of them try anything, the cops will nail them. It was one hell of a weekend. I'm going to take you back in time to the year 2007, when I was 16. Picture a Norman Rockwell-esque suburban family. Parents, 3 kids, a yard and a dog. In a blink and you'll miss it, in the USA. One random day, a neighbor of ours has a mild dispute with another neighbor. As a totally warranted response, everyone's favorite neighbor, Mr. Sampson, takes every hose he has and floods the other's yard. A solid decision leads to a solid consequence, so naturally he was fined for water waste. My parents run the water in our small town in the USA, and because Mr. Sampson lived a block away from us, he decided to drive over to the water district, shouting that he is an acquaintance of my parents. Second solid decision of many to come from Mr. Sampson. Absolutely no one takes kindly to name droppers, so tuck that gem away under your life facts. My parent comes in and tells him that even if his kid did this, they would still have the same repercussions, gracefully glossing over the fact that other than maybe driving by one another, none of us have ever had an interaction with Mr. Sampson. Mr. Sampson repeats the name of the man working the front desk as well as my parents' name and claims it's now personal, and storms out. My family members and I begin to see Mr. Sampson at random places, constantly the DMVs, the grocery stores, our respective jobs. Apparently, when you're cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs and your parents pay for your house, you have all kinds of time to stalk. It went from random sightings while out and about to phone calls, the cliche 90s types calls of breathing and hanging up. I can see you variety. At this point, Mr. Sampson was more of an annoyance than scary, but as I've stated, when you underestimate crazy, you lose every time. Mr. Sampson began parking across from our house, staying from 6 p.m. to 4 a.m., literally sitting in his car blasting music just staring at the house. Fool must have had the determination and bladder of a racehorse, because who the hell sits out there for 10 hours? His music was trash too. Maybe he was a masochist into self-harm, seeing how long he could suffer through terrible music and a full bladder. I doubt anyone with a semi-rational concept of social interaction would fathom why. This went on from 3 to 4 times a week to a nightly occurrence. Imagine being a 16-year-old female that doesn't even feel comfortable to change in her room because of the prospect he might see through the blinds somehow, trying to sleep knowing he's out there. We were prisoners in our own home. He began to get bolder. Mr. Sampson drove his car speeding and up onto the sidewalk at my sibling and her partner while they were on the sidewalk out front coming home from a date. They both had to physically jump out the way to avoid being hit. He made lewd gestures at me when I brought my dog out for a walk and was waiting for my sibling to come and join us. It was so bad I ended up crying and going inside. This has been going on for a year at this point. The cops always said the same thing. There's nothing we can do unless there's a threat made against you or someone is harmed. My parents confronted Mr. Sampson in the street, being tired of his nonsense and asking him what the hell he's doing after my incident, to which Mr. Sampson called the cops, and they came asking why we were harassing and threatening him. I will never understand why the system waits until you're a victim rather than prevent someone from being victimized. Almost 2 years in and it's Christmas time. My parent has a brain aneurysm. Fortunately, they made it through without any lingering effects, which is extremely rare. I convinced my other parent, who had been living at the hospital with their sick partner, to come home and shower and eat. About 9 p.m. we get a knock at the door. A random man in ratty clothes holding a Christmas present says that he's there to deliver it, to family name. We ask who sent it, and he says that he can't say. We ask who he works for, and he shoves the gift at my parents and leaves. We're obviously uncomfortable to open it. My parents decide they need to know what it is. They open it. Inside is a 17-page document of the grounds why Mr. Sampson is suing my parent that was currently in the hospital. Even I could tell it was fake with the grammatical errors and typos.
Mr. Sampson took the time to sit and type this up himself, thinking it would scare us. The document and fake detail he put in did not. The fact that this 40-something-year-old man was so fixated on our family that he sat and typed 17 pages of fake documents did scare us. Things progressed, and Mr. Sampson began pacing in front of his car and pretending to have a phone call, where he talked about punching my parents down the stairs or knowing where the kids went to school and worked and how easy it would be to access us at any time. At the time, I worked a closing shift that let off about 1 a.m. He would be parked next to my car and follow me home. One time I even tried to make random roads and he still stayed straight behind me, pulling up to the house with Mr. Sampson parked across the street. Think a neighborhood street, with cars a good 5 feet away from each other and having to get out and run to the door. It was a nightmare. We were all exhausted from not only the aneurysm scare but also living and looking over our shoulder. My parents' friend told her friend, who is a district attorney, about the situation. She called and came over and took our case pro bono. Testifying was a wild ride. We had to put in official statements prior to being called to the stand. We were not allowed to be in the room where a family member was testifying, nor were we allowed to talk in the halls as we waited for our turn. Imagine reliving 2+ years of traumatic experiences, being cross-examined where you're made out to be a liar, and then not able to have your family come to support you afterwards was not ideal. It was enough to put him away for 1.5 years, as well as grant a felony restraining order. We moved while he was still incarcerated. My sister passed while he was in prison. He immediately tried to sue her estate, as she was 21 at her death when he was released. He claimed that her testimony from him running up the car at her and her partner was false, and the only reason he was locked up, not the real case as there were harassment and stalking charges, and that the money people donated to a GoFundMe for her accident he was entitled to. There are so many more details, but this was already long enough. So let's not meet, Mr. Sampson. Let's never ever meet again. You made us prisoners in our own home. Clearly you're still the same and have not learnt a thing from your time locked up.
I was up in the attic doing some work, and I found this small room that you could only access from the attic. So I climbed down and found a rocking chair with a wicker monkey sitting on it. At first I thought it was a dead baby, and screamed like a little girl, and then came to my senses and burned the wicker monkey because it looked evil. I'm still convinced I did the right thing to do. Who would have left it there, and why? The other day I found this upside-down cross on the attic in the new apartment we moved to. My mother brought with her a small angel statue holding a book with the Our Father prayer written on it. She had this figure since she was a small child, and yesterday it fell out of her closet, down to the ground and smashed to 1,000,000 pieces without any of us being near to it, or having the windows open. We also have experienced footsteps and our TV randomly turning on. We have a chow, a breed that in ancient China was used to ward off evil spirits, and he barks all the time at our attic. This could have a logical explanation, but might there be something paranormal festering up there? The other day I was gaming with my friends when suddenly I felt a hand on my shoulder. It was around 2 a.m. and no one else was there. Then I told my friends about the sudden touch, and they thought I was crazy. Has anyone had further experiences with this? And does anyone know what this could have been?